with all the knowledge I was hoping for and then some in my field of study. Right when I came in my freshman year, I had the opportunity of helping out with the football and basketball broadcast on KALA and SAU TV. Now, as a senior, I lead the play-by-play duties for those games. I also host a sports talk show on 88.5 and 106.1 FM. St. Ambrose gives you all the opportunities. All you have to do is be willing to reach out and get involved. Don't sit back and wait for the opportunities. Make it happen, and St. Ambrose will provide the rest. Coming to this school and getting involved with KALA and SAU TV was one of the best choices I've made. So if you're getting into the radio TV business here at St. Ambrose, go out, be social, and get involved as soon as possible.
All right then. So it's currently 3:02 p.m. I'm a little late, but that's fine. Welcome to Paper Cuts, everybody. I'm Glacier Nestor. You might know me as Michael Harp. But last week we finished up War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, and that was a good time. But now we get into the focus of the program for as long as I can find issues of it. We're going to be reading a science fiction serial magazine by the name of Astounding Stories of Super Science. We're beginning with the January 1930 issue, and our first story is called The Beetle Horde. It's by Victor Rousseau. Chapter 1, Dodd's Discovery. Out of the south, the biplane came winging back toward the camp, a black speck against the dazzling white of vast ice fields that extended unbroken to the horizon on every side. It came out of the south, and yet, 100 miles further back along the course which it flew, it couldn't have proceeded in any direction except northward. For 100 miles south away the South Pole, the goal toward which the Travers expeditions had been pressing for the better part of the year. Not that they could have reached it sooner. As a matter of fact, the pole had been crossed and recrossed, according to the estimate of Tommy Travers, the aviator, and the nephew of the old millionaire, who stood fairy uncle to the expedition. But one of the things that was not being sought was the exact site of the pole. Not within a couple of miles or so, but within a fraction of the inch. It had something to do with Einstein and something to do with terrestrial magnetism, and the variations of the southern magnetic pole, and the reason, therefore, and something to do with parallaxes and the precession of equinoxes and other such things, that the search for the pole's exact location was being undertaken. But all that was principally the affair of the astronomer of the party. Tommy Travers, who was now evidently on his way back, didn't give a hoop about Einstein or any of the rest of the stuff for that matter. He'd been enjoying himself after a fashion during a year of frostbites and hard rations, and he was beginning to anticipate the delights of the return to Broadway. Captain Storm, who was in charge of the expedition, together with the 5 others of the advance camp, watched the plane maneuver up to the tents. She came down neatly on the smooth snow, skidded on her runners like an expert skater, and came to a stop almost immediately in front of the marquee. Tommy Travers leaped out of the enclosed cockpit, which, shut off by glass from the cabin, was something like the front seat of a limousine. "Well, Captain, we followed that break for 100 miles, and there's no ground cleft as you expected," he said. "But Jim Dodd and I picked up something, and Jim seems to have gone crazy." Through the windows of the cabin, Jim Dodd, the young archaeologist of the party, could be seen apparently wrestling with something that looked like a suit of armor. By the time Captain Storm, Jimmy, and the other members of the party had reached the cabin door, Dodd had gotten it open and flung himself out backwards, still hugging what he'd found, and maneuvering so that he managed to fall on his back and sustain its weight. "Say, what is that?" gasped Storm. Even the least scientific-minded of the party gasped in amazement at what Dodd had. It resembled nothing so much as an enormous beetle. As a matter of fact, it was an insect, for it had the 3 sections that characterized this class, but it was merely the shell of one. Between 4 and 5 feet in height, when Dodd stood it on end, it could now be seen to consist of the hard exterior substance of some huge, unknown coleopter. Well, question of the day, what's coleopter? Coleopter, an order of insects that comprises the beetles, including weevils, forming the largest order of animals on the earth. duly noted. This substance, which was fully 3 inches thick over the thorax, looked as hard as plate armor. What is it?" gasped Storm again. Tommy Travers made answer, for James Dodd was evidently incapable of speech, more from emotion than from the force with which he landed backward in the snow.
"We found it at the pole, Captain. At least, pretty near where the pole ought to be. We ran into a current of warm air or something. The snow had melted in places, and there were patches of bare rock. This thing was lying in a hollow among them."
"If I didn't see it before my eyes, I'd think you crazy, Tommy," said Storm with some asperity. "What is it, a crab?" "Crab be damned," shouted Jim Dodd, suddenly recovering his faculties. "Dear Hylia, Captain Storm, don't you know the difference between an insect and a crustacean? This is a fossil beetle. Don't you see the distinguishing mark of the coleoptera? Those two elytra are the wing covers which meet the median dorsal line. A beetle, but with the shell of a crustacean instead of mere kitten. That's what led you astray, I expect. Goodness, what a tale we'll have to tell when we get back to New York. We'll drop everything else and spend years, if need be, looking for other specimens."
"Like hell you will,"
shouted Higby, the astronomer of the party. "Let me tell you right there, Dodd, nobody outside the Museum of Natural History is going to give a damn about your old fossils. What we're going to do is to march straight to the true pole and spend a year taking observations and parallaxes. If Einstein's brochure, in which he links up gravitation with magnetism, is correct..." "Fossil beetles!" Jim Dodd burst out, ignoring the astronomer. "That means in the tertiary era, probably, there existed forms of life in the Antarctic continent which have never been found elsewhere. Imagine a world in which the insect reached a size proportioned to the great saurians, Captain Storm. I'll wager poor Bram discovered this. That's why he stayed behind when the Greystoke expedition came within 100 miles of the pole. I'll wager he's left a cairn somewhere with full details inside it. We've got to find it, But Jim Dodd, suddenly realizing the rest of his party could hardly be said to share his enthusiasm in any marked degree, broke off and looked sulky. "You say you found this thing pretty nearly upon the site of the true pole?" Captain Storm asked calmly.
"Within 5 miles, I'd say, Captain. The fog was so bad we couldn't get our directions very well."
"Well, then there's going to be no difficulty," answered Storm. "If this fair weather lasts, we'll be at the pole in another week, and we'll start making our permanent camp there. Plenty of opportunity for all you gentlemen. As for me, I'm merely a sailor. I'm trying to be impartial. And please remember, gentlemen, we're well into March now, and likely to have the first storms of autumn on us any day. So let's drop the argument, and remember that we've got to pull together." Tommy Travers was the only skilled aviator of the expedition, which had brought 2 planes with it. It was a strange friendship that had sprung up between him and Jim Dodd. Tommy, the blasé ex-Harvard man, who was known along Broadway and had never been able to settle down, seemed as different as possible from the spectacled, scholarly Dodd, 10 years his senior, red-haired, inscrutable, and living, as Tommy put it, in the age of Old Red Sandstone, instead of the year 1930 A.D. It was generally known, though the story had been officially denied, that there had been trouble in the Greystoke expedition of 3 years before. Captain Greystoke had taken the brilliant, erratic Bram of the Carnegie Archaeological Institute with him, and Bram's history was a long record of trouble. It was Bram who had exploded the faked Neolithic finds at Mannheim, thereby earning the undying enmity of certain European savants, but brilliantly demolishing them when he smashed the so-called Mannheim stone pitcher, valued at $100,000, with a pocket axe, and caustically inquired whether Neolithic men used Babbitt metal rivets to fasten on his jug handles. Bram's brilliant work in the investigation of the origin of the Asiatic races had been awarded one of the Nobel Prizes, but Bram had declined it in an insulting letter because he disapproved of the year's prize award for literature. He'd been on a storm center for years, embittered by long opposition when he joined the Greystoke expedition for the purpose of investigating the marine fauna of the Antarctic continent. And it was known that his presence had nearly brought the Greystoke expedition to the point of civil war. Rumor said he'd been deliberately abandoned. His enemies had hoped he had. The facts seemed to be, however, that in an outburst of temper, he walked out of the camp in a furious snowstorm and perished. They sought for his body for days, in vain, unfortunately. Jimmy Dodd had run foul of Bram some years before, when Bram had published a criticism of one of Dodd's addresses dealing with fossil monotremes, or egg-laying mammals. In his inimitable way, Bram had suggested that the problem which came first, the egg or the chicken, was now seemed to be linked up with the Darwinian theory and solved in the person of Dodd. Nevertheless, Jimmy Dodd entertained a devoted admiration for the memory of the dead scientist. He believed that Bram must have left records of inestimable importance in a cairn before he died. He needed to find that cairn. And he knew, what a number of Bram's enemies knew, that the dead scientist had been a morphine addict. He believed that he'd wandered out into the snow under the influence of the drug. Dodd, who shared a tent with Tommy, had raved the greater part of the night about the find.
Well, see here, Jimmy. Suppose these beetles did inhabit the Antarctic continent a few million years ago. Why is this exciting?
Exciting? Bellowed Dodd. It opens one of the biggest problems that science has to face. Why haven't they survived in historic times? Why didn't they cross into Australia like the opossum by the land bridge, and then existent between the continent and South America? Beetles 5 feet in length and practically invulnerable. What killed them off? Why didn't they win the supremacy over man? Jimmy Dodd had muttered until he went to sleep, and he'd muttered worse in his dreams. Tommy was glad that Captain Storm had given them permission to return to the same spot next morning and look for further fossils, though his own interest in them was slight at best. The dogs were being harnessed next morning when the two men hopped into the plane. The thermometer was unusually high for the season, for in the South Polar regions, the short summer is usually at an end by March. Tommy was sweating in his furs at a temperature well above the freezing point. The snow was crusted hard, the sky overcast with clouds, and a wind was blowing hard out of the south, and increasing in velocity hourly. "A bad day for starting," said Captain Storm. "Looks like one of the autumn storms was blowing up. If I were you, I'd watch the weather, Tommy." Tommy glanced at Dodd, who was huddled in the rear cockpit, fuming at the delay, and grinned whimsically.
I guess I can handle her, Captain. It's only an hour's flight to where we found that fossil anyway.
"Just as you please," said Storm curtly. He knew that Tommy's judgment as a pilot could always be relied upon. "You'll find us here when you return," he added. "I've countermanded the order to march. I don't like the look of the weather at all." Tommy grinned again and pressed the starter. The engine caught and warmed up. One of the men kicked away the blocks of ice that had been placed under the skids to serve as chocks, and the plane taxied over the crusted snow and took off into the south. The camp was situated in a hollow among the ice mountains that rose to a height of 2,000 or 3,000 feet all around. Tommy had not dreamed of how strongly the gale was blowing until he was over the top of them. Then he realized he was facing a tougher proposition than he'd calculated on. The storm struck the biplane with full force. A snowstorm was driving up rapidly, blackening the sky. The sun, which only appeared for a brief interval every day, was practically touching the horizon as it rose to make its minute arc in the sky. A star was visible through a rift in the clouds overhead, and the pale daylight in which they had started had already become twilight. Tommy was tempted to turn back, but it was only 100 miles, and Jimmy Dodd would give him no peace if he did so. So he put the plane's nose resolutely into the wind, watching his speed indicator drop from 100 miles an hour to 80, 60, 40, less. The storm was beating up furiously. Of a sudden, the clouds broke into a deluge of whirling snow. In a moment, the windshield was frozen. A frozen, opaque mass. Tommy opened it and peered out into the biting air. He couldn't see anything. The plane, caught in fearful cross-currents that swirled about the southern roof of the world, was fluttering like a leaf in the wind. The altimeter was dropping dangerously. Tommy opened the throttle to the limit, zooming, and like a spurred horse, the biplane shot forward and upward. She touched 5,000, 6, 7, and that for her was ceiling under those conditions. And for a sudden, tremendous shock of wind coming in a cross-current, it swung around, tossed her to and fro in the enveloping white cloud, and Tommy knew that he had the fight of his life upon his hands. The compasses, which required considerable daily adjusting to be of use so near to the pole, had now gone out of use altogether. The airspeed indicator had apparently gone west, for it was oscillating between 0 and 20. The turn and bank indicator was performing a kind of tango around the dial. Even the 8-day clock had ceased to function, but that might have been due to the fact that Tommy had neglected to wind it. And the oil pressure gauge presented a still more startling sight, for a glance showed that either there was a leak, or else the oil had frozen. Tommy looked around at Dodd and pointed downward, and Dodd responded with a vicious forward wave of his hand. Tommy shook his head, and Dodd started forward along the cabin, apparently with the intention of committing assault and battery upon him. Instead, the archaeologist collapsed upon the floor as the plane spun completely around under the impact of a blast that was like a giant slap. The plane was no longer controllable. True, she responded in some sort to the controls, but all Tommy was able to do was to keep her from going into a crazy sideslip or nosedive as he fought with the elements. And those elements were like a devil unchained. One moment he was dropping like a plummet, the next he was shooting up like a rocket as a vertical blast of air caught the plane and tossed her like a cork into the invisible heavens. Then she was revolving, as if in a maelstrom, and by degrees this rotary movement began to predominate. Round and round went the plane in circles that gradually narrowed, and it was all Tommy could do to swing the stick as to keep her from skidding or sideslipping. And as he worked desperately at his task, Tommy began to realize that something made him wonder if he wasn't dreaming. The snow was no longer snow, but rain. Mist, rather. Warm mist that had already cleared the windshield and covered it with tiny drops. And that white, opaque world into which he was looking at was no longer snow, but fog. The densest fog that Tommy had ever encountered. Fog like white wool, drifting past him in fleecy flakes that looked as if they had some kind of solid substance. Warm fog that was like balm upon his frozen skin, but of a warmth that was impossible within a few miles of the frozen pole. Then there came a momentary break in it, and Tommy looked down and uttered a cry of fear. Fear because he knew he must be dreaming. Not more than 1,000 feet beneath him, he saw patches of snow and patches of green grass, the brightest and most verdant green that he'd ever seen in his life. He turned round at a touch on his shoulder. Dodd was leaning over him, one hand pointing menacingly onward and upward. "You fool!" Tommy bellowed in his ear. Do you think the South Pole lies over there? It's here! Don't you get it, Jimmy? Look down. This valley. Good heavens, Jimmy, the South Pole is a hole in the ground." And as he spoke, he remembered vaguely some crank who had once insisted the two poles were hollow because... what was the fellow's reasoning? Tommy couldn't remember it. But there was no longer any doubt that they were dropping into a hole. Not more than a mile around, which explained why neither Scott nor Edmondson had found it when they approximated to the side of the pole either. A hole, a warm hole, up which a current of warm air was rushing, forming the white mist that now gradually thinned as the plane descended. The plateau, with its covering of eternal snows, loomed in a white circle high overhead. Underneath was green grass now. Grass and trees. The fog was nearly gone. The plane responded to the controls again. Tommy pushed the stick forward and came round in a tighter circle. And then something happened that he had not in the least expected. One moment he seemed to be traveling in a complete calm, a sort of clear funnel with a ring of swirling fog outside of it, and the next he was dropping into a void. There was no air resistance. There seemed hardly any air, for he felt a choking in his throat and a tearing at his lungs as he strove to breathe. He heard a strangled cry from Dodd and saw that he was clutching with both hands at his throat, and that his face was turning purple. The controls went limp in Tommy's hands. The plane, gyrating more slowly, suddenly nosed down, hung for a moment in that void, and then plunged toward the green earth, 200 feet below, with appalling swiftness. Tommy realized that a crash was inevitable. He threw his goggles up over his forehead, turned and waved to Dodd in an ironic farewell. He saw the earth rush up at him, then came the shattering crash, and then oblivion. Chapter 2. Beetles and Humans. How long he had remained unconscious, Tommy had no means of determining. Of a sudden, he found himself lying on the ground beside the shattered plane with his eyes wide open. He stared at it and stared about him, without understanding where he was or what had happened to him. His first idea was that he had crashed on the golf links near Mitchell Field, Long Island, for all about him were stretches of verdant grass and small shrubby plants. Then, when he remembered the expedition, he was convinced that he'd been dreaming. What brought him to a saner view was the discovery that he was enveloped in furs which were insufferably hot. He half raised himself and succeeded in unfastening his fur coat, and thus discovered that apparently none of his bones had broken. But the plane must have fallen from a considerable height to be that badly smashed. Then Tommy discovered he was lying upon an extensive mound of sand, thrown up as if by some gigantic mole, for burrow tracks ran through it in every direction. It was this that had saved his life. Something was moving at his side. It was half submerged in the sand pile, and it was moving parallel to him with great rapidity. A grayish body, half covered with grains of sands, emerged, waving two enormously long tentacles. It was a shrimp, but fully 3 feet in length, and Tommy had never before had any idea what an unpleasant object a shrimp is. Tommy staggered to his feet and dropped nearer the plane, eyeing the shrimp with horror. But he was soon relieved as he discovered that it was apparently harmless. It slithered away and once more buried itself in the pile of sand. Now Tommy was beginning to remember. He looked into the wreckage of the plane, and Jim Dodd wasn't there. He called his name repeatedly, and there was no response except a dull echo from the ice mountains beyond the veil of fog. He went to the other side of the plane and scanned the ground all about him. Jimmy had disappeared. It was evident that he was nowhere near, for Tommy could see the whole of the lower scope of the bowl on every side of him. He'd walked away, or perhaps been carried away. Tommy thought of the shrimp and shuddered. What other fearsome monsters might inhabit that extraordinary valley? He sat down, leaning against the wreck of the fuselage, and tried to adjust his mind, tried to keep himself from going mad. He knew now that the flight had been no dream, that he was a member of his uncle's expedition, that he'd flown with Jim toward the pole and crashed in a vacuum. But where was Jim? How were they going to get out of here? Something like a heap of stones not far away attracted Tommy's attention. Perhaps Jim Dodd was lying behind that. Once more, Tommy got upon his feet and began walking towards it. On the way, he stumbled against the sharp edge of something that protruded against the ground. It cut his leg sharply, and with a curse, he began rubbing his shin and looking at the thing. Then he saw that it was another of the fossil shells, half buried in the marshy ooze on which he was treading. The ground in this lower part of the valley was a swamp, on account of the very fine mist falling from the fog clouds that surrounded it impenetrably on either side. Then Tommy came upon another shell, and then another, and now that he saw there were piles of what he had been taken to be rock everywhere, but this wasn't rock. It was great heaps of the shells, all equally intact. Hundreds of thousands of the prehistoric beetles must have died in that valley, perhaps overcome by some cataclysm. Tommy examined the heap to which near he stood, and yelled Dodd's name, but no answer came. Instead, something began to stir among the heaps of the shells. For a moment, Tommy hoped against hope that it was Dodd, but it wasn't Dodd. It was a living beetle. A beetle fully 5 feet high as it stood erect, a pair of enormous wings outspread, and the head, which was larger than a man's, was the most frightful object Tommy had ever seen. Jim Dodd would have said at once that this was one of the Curculionidae. Man, scientific names. Jim Dodd would have at once said that this was one of the Curculionidae, or snout beetles, for a prolongation of the head between the eyes formed a sort of beak a foot in length. The mouth, which opened downward, was armed with terrific mandibles, while the huge compound eyes looked like enormous crystals of cut glass. Immediately in the front of the eyes were two mandibles as long as a man's arms, with with feathery processes at the ends. In addition to these, there were 3 pairs of legs, the front pair as long as a man's and the hind pair almost as long as a horse's. Paralyzed with horror, Tommy watched the monster, which had apparently been disturbed by the vibrations of his voice, extract itself from among the shells. Then, with a bound that covered 15 feet, it had lessened the distance between them by half. And then a still more amazing thing happened. For a sudden, the hard shell dropped from the thorax, the wing cases slipped off, the whole of the bony parts slipped to the ground with a clang, and a soft, defenseless thing went slithering away among the rocks. The beetle had molted. Tommy dropped to the ground in the throes of violent nausea. But as he looked up, he saw the girl. She was about 100 yards away from him, very close to the fallen plane, and she must have emerged from a large hole in the ground, which Tommy could now see under a ledge of overhanging rock. She seemed to be dressed in a simple garment, which fell to her knees and appeared to fit tightly about her body. But as she came nearer, Tommy, watching her, petrified by this latest apparition, discovered that it was woven of her own hair, which must have been of immense length, for it fell naturally to her shoulders, and thence was woven into this close-fitting material, a fringe an inch or 2 in length extending beneath the selvage. Okay, selvage, what does that mean? Question of the day. Show me. Selvage, an edge-produced unwoven fabric during manufacture that prevents it from unraveling. Neat. She was about 6 feet tall and apparently made after the normal human pattern. She moved with a slow, majestic swing, and if ever any female had seemed to Tommy to have the appearance of an angel, this unknown woman did. She was so fair in that flossy, flaxen covering, she moved with such an easy grace that Tommy, gaping, gradually crept nearer to her. She didn't seem to see him. She was stooping over the very sand heap into which she had fallen. And suddenly, with lightning-like rapidity, her arms shot out, her hands began tunneling in the sand. With a cry of triumph, she pulled out the shrimp Tommy had seen, or at least another like it, and, stripping off the shell, began devouring it with evident relish. In the midst of her meal, the girl raised her head and looked at Tommy. He saw then that her eyes were filmed, vacant, dead. Then all of a sudden, a third membrane was drawn back across the pupils, and she saw him. She let the shrimp drop to the ground, uttered a cry, and moved toward him with a tottering gait. She groped toward him with outstretched arms, and then she was blind again, for the membrane once more covered her pupils. It was as if her eyes were unable to endure even the dim light of the valley, through whose surrounding mist the low sun, setting just above the horizon, was unable to diffuse itself save as a brightening of the fog curtain. Tommy stepped toward the girl. His outstretched hand touched hers. It was unquestionably a woman's hand he held, delicately warm with exquisitely molded fingers, in whose touch there seemed to be, for the girl, some tactile impression of him. Again that membrane was drawn back from the girl's pupils for a fleeting flash. Tommy saw 2 eyes of intense black, their color contrasting furiously with the flaxen color of her hair and her white skin, almost with the tint of an albino. Those eyes had surveyed him, and appeared satisfied that he was one of their kind. She couldn't have seen very much in that almost instantaneous flash of vision. Strange, that membrane, as if she was used to living in the dark, as if the full light of the day was unbearable. She drew her hand away, and soft vocals came from her lips. Suddenly, she turned swiftly. She couldn't have seen, but before Tommy had seen, she had sensed the presence of the old man who was creeping out of the hole in the mountainside. He moved forward craftily, then pounced upon the sand pile, and in a moment had pulled out another of the big shrimps, which he proceeded to devour with greedy relish. The girl, leaving Tommy's side, joined him in that unpleasant feast. And in the midst of it, a flood came pouring from the hole, a flood of living beetles, covering the ground in 15-foot leaps as they dashed at the two. To his horror, Tommy saw Jimmy Dodd among them, wrapped in his fur coat like a mummy, and being pushed and rolled forward like a football. For a moment, Tommy hesitated, torn between his solicitude for Jim Dodd
and that for the girl. Then, as the foremost of the monsters bounded to her side, he ran between them. The vicious jaws snapped within 6 inches of Tommy's face, with a force that would have carried away an ear or shredded the cheek if they had met. Tommy struck out with all his might, and his fist clanged on the resounding shell so that the blood spurted from his bruised knuckles. He struck the monster squarely upon the thorax, and he had not discommoded it in the least. It turned on him, its glassy, many-faceted eyes glaring with a cold, infernal light. Tommy struck out again with his left hand, this time upon the pulpy flesh of the downward opening mouth. An inch higher, and he would have impaled his hand upon the beak with a point like a needle, and evidently used for purposes of attack since it wasn't connected with the mandibles. The blow appeared to fall in the only vulnerable place. The monster dropped upon its back and lay there, unable to reverse itself, its antenna and forelegs waving in the air, and the rear legs rasping together in a shrill, strident shriek. Instantly, as Tommy darted out of the way, the swarm fell upon the helpless monster and began devouring it, tearing strips of flesh from the lower shell, which in the space of a half-minute was reduced simply to the bone. The most horrible act of this feature of cannibalism was the complete silence with which it was performed, except for the rasping of the dying monster's legs. It was evident that the huge beetles had no vocal apparatus. For the moment, left unguarded, Jim Dodd flung down the collar of his fur coat, stared about him, and recognized Tommy. "Good heavens, it's you!" he yelled. "Well, could you—" He had no time to finish his sentence. A pair of antennae went round his neck from behind. At the same instant, Tommy, the old man, and the girl were gripped by the monsters, which, forming a solid phalanx about them, began hustling them in the direction of the hole. Resistance was utterly impossible. Tommy felt as if he was being pushed along by a moving wall of stone. Inside the opening, it was completely dark. Tommy shouted to Dodd, but the strident sounds of the moving legs drowned his cries. He was being pushed forward into the unknown. Suddenly, the ground seemed to fall away beneath his feet. He struggled, cried out, and felt himself descending through the air. For a full half-minute, he went downward at such a speed that constricted his throat, so that he could hardly draw breath. Then, just as he had nerved himself for the imminent crash, the speed of his descent was checked. In another moment, he found that he was slowing to a standstill in midair. He was beginning to float upward, but the wall of moving shells pushing against him forced him on downward, and yet, apparently against the force of gravitation. Then, of a sudden, Tommy was aware of a dim light all about him. His feet touched earth and grass as softly as a thistledown alighting. He found himself seated in the same dim light upon red grass and stared into Jimmy's face. Oh, sorry about that lack of noise. I have to take a moment to get some water between chapters. Chapter 3, 10 miles underground. "What was I going to say when you were interrupted? Can you beat it?" Jim Dodd observed with an admirable sang-froid. They were still seated on the red grass, gazing about them at what looked like an illimitable plain and upward into depths of darkness. It was warm, and the light, furnished by what appeared to be luminous vegetation, was about that of twilight. On every side were clumps and trees of shrubs, which formed centers of phosphorescent illumination. But for the most part the land was open, and here and there human figures appeared, moving with head down and arms dangling earthward.
No, I'm darned if I can. What happened to you after we crashed?
Why, the first thing I knew, I found myself riding on the back of a fossil beetle, apparently one of the Curliculionidae, said Dodd. Never mind being so precise, Jimmy, just call it a beetle. Go on. They set me down inside the hole and seemed to be investigating me, the whole swarm of them. Of course, they thought I was dead and come to my just reward, especially when I saw those beaks. Then one of them began tickling my face with its antenna, and I drew up my fur collar. They didn't seem to like the feel of the fur, and after a while the whole gang started hustling me back again, like a nest of ants carrying something they don't want outside their hill. And then you bobbed up.
Well, my opinion is you saved your life by pulling up your collar. Looks to me as if it's a case of the survival of the fittest, and the fittest being the insect and the human race taking second place. You know what the humans here live on, don't you?
No, what?
Shrimps as big as poodles. If you'd seen that girl and the old man outside getting them, you'd realize there seems to be somewhat of a food shortage in this part of the world. Say, where in thunder are we, Jimmy?
Haven't you guessed yet, Travers? Asked Dodd, a spice of malice in his voice.
I suppose this is some sort of big hole on the side of the South Pole, with warm vapors coming up. Maybe a great fissure in the earth or something.
Jimmy Dodd's grin, seen in the half-light, was rather disconcerting. How far do you think we dropped just now?
Why, I'd say several hundred yards. How's your guess?
Just about 10 miles.
What? You're still crazy. Why, we slowed up.
Yeah, we slowed up. We're inside the crust of the world, that's the long and short of it. The Earth we've known is just a shell over our heads.
Yeah? Walking head downward, are we? Then why don't we drop to the center of the Earth, you fool?
Because, my dear fellow, you can swing a pail full of water around your head without spilling any of it. In other words, our old friend, centrifugal force. The speed with which the Earth is rotating keeps us on our feet, head downward. To be precise, the center of the Earth's gravity lies in the middle of the hollow sphere, of course, but the counteraction of the centrifugal force throws it outward to the middle of the 10-mile crust. That's why we slowed down after we were halfway through. We were moving against gravity.
And what's up there, or down there, or however you call it?
Asked Tommy, pointing to what ought to have been the sky. Nothing. It's the center of the tennis ball, though I imagine it's pretty near a vacuum when you get up a mile or so, owing the speed of the Earth's rotation, which forces heat into the shell.
You mean to say you actually believe the stuff you've been handing me? Then how'd human beings get here? And those beetles? And why is the grass red?
The grass is red because there's no sunlight to produce chlorophyll. The inhabitants of the deep sea are red and black almost invariably. In the case of the humans, they've become bleached. My belief is that the man and woman we saw in those... He pointed to the vague forms of human beings who moved along the grass, gathering something. Are survivors of the primitive race that still exists as the Australians. Undoubtedly, one of the branches of this human stock originated in Antarctica at a time when it enjoyed a tropical temperature, and there was the land bridge between Australia and South America.
And the beetles?
Asked Tommy. They go back to days when nature was in a more grandiose mood, replied the archaeologist enthusiastically. That's the most wonderful discovery of the ages. The world will go crazy over them when we bring back the first living specimens to the zoological parks of the great cities. But, Dodd went on, speaking with still more enthusiasm, of course this is only the beginning, Tommy. There are 10 million species of insects, according to Riley, and it's inevitable that there must be hundreds of thousands of other survivals, from the age of the great saurians, perhaps even some of the saurians themselves. Who knows but that we may discover the ancestor of the extinct monotremes, the rhinocephalia, the pterodactyls, hatch a brood of Apiornis eggs?
And, Tommy said tartly, how are we going to get them back, apart from the little problem of getting out of here ourselves?
Don't worry about that now, answered Dodd. It'll take 10 years, the hardest kind of labor, even to begin a classification of the inhabitants of this inner world. I could sit forever and... But Jimmy Dodd rose to his feet as a pair of antennae whipped around his neck and jerked him bodily upward. One of the monster beetles was standing upright behind them, and by its gestures it evidently meant that Dodd and Tommy were to join the crowd of humans in the offing. As Dodd turned upon it with an indignant show of fists, one of the antennae whipped off his fur coat and stung him painfully with a bristle-like attachment at the end. It was a painful moment when Dodd and Tommy realized they were powerless against the monstrous beetles. Tommy tried the uppercut with which he had knocked out the deceased monster, but the quick jerks of the present beetle's head were infinitely faster than the movements of his fists, while the antennae had a whip-like quality about them that speedily convinced him that the discretion was the card to play. Under the threat of the curling antenna, Tommy and Dodd moved in the direction of the slowly circulating humans. Numerous tiny rodents, which evidently kept the red grass short, scampered away under their feet. The beetles made no further effort to force them on, but now that they could see, a number of the monsters were stationed at intervals along a wide circle, keeping the humans in a single body.
Good heavens! See what they're doing, Dodd? They're herding us like cowboys herd steers. Look at that.
One of the herd, a male with a long beard, suddenly broke from it, bawling and flung himself upon a beetle guard. The antenna shot forth, coiled around his neck, and hurled him a dozen feet to the ground, where he lay stunned for a moment before arising and rejoining his companions. "But what are they looking for?" demanded Dodd. Tommy hadn't heard him. He'd stopped in front of one of the luminous trees and was plucking a fruit from it.
Jimmy, have you ever seen an apple like this before? Well, if it isn't an apple, I'll eat my head.
It certainly was an apple, and one of the largest and juiciest that Tommy had ever tasted. It was the reddest apple he'd ever seen, and easily would have won the first prize at any agricultural fair.
And look at this!
Shouted Tommy, plucking an enormous luminous peach from another tree. They began munching slowly, then, seeing one of the beetle guards approaching them, they moved into the midst of the crowd. "Did you notice anything strange about those fruit trees?" inquired Dodd as he munched. "I'll swear they were monocotyledonous, which is, after all, what one would expect. Still, to think the monocotyledons evolved the similar drupes or stone fruits on a parallel line to the dicotyledons is amazing." A box on the ear, like the kick of a mule's hoof, jerked the last word from his lips as he went sprawling. He got up to see the girl standing before him, intense disgust and anger on her face. She snatched the fruits from the hands of the two Americans and hurled them away. It was evident from her manner that she considered such diet in the highest degree unclean and disgusting, and also that she considered herself charged with the duty of superintending Tommy and Dodd's education, but especially Dodd's. Taking him by the arm, she propelled him into the midst of the groping humans. She released him, stopped, and suddenly stood up, a shrimp about 18 inches long in her hand. Towering over Dodd by 6 inches, she took his face in her hands and began caressing them. Then, seizing his jaws in her strong fingers, pried them apart and popped the tail end of the shrimp into his mouth. Dodd let out a yelp and spat out the love gift, to be rewarded with another box on the ear by the young Amazon. While Tommy stood by, convulsed with laughter, yet in considerable trepidation for the fear of being forced to share Dodd's fate. For the girl was again holding out the tail end of the crustacean, and Jim Dodd's jaws were slowly and reluctantly approaching it. But suddenly there came an intervention as the strident rasping of the beetle legs was heard in the distance. Panic seized the human herd, groveling for shrimps in the sandy soil with its tufts of red grasses. Milling in an uneasy mob, they cowered under the lashes of the antennae of the beetle guards, which sacrificed their backs through their hair garments whenever any of them tried to bolt. Nearer and nearer came the beetles, louder and more penetrating the shriek of their rasping legs. Now the swarm came into sight, rank after rank of the shell-clad monsters, leaping 15 feet at a bound with perfect precision, until they had formed a solid phalanx all around the humans. Tommy heard sighs of despair, he heard muttering, and then realized with deep thankfulness that these human beings, degraded though they were, had a speech of their own. In the middle of the front line appeared a beetle a foot taller than the rest. That it was either a king or a queen was evident by the respect paid it by the rest of the swarm. At its every moment a bodyguard of beetles moved in unison, forming themselves in a group before it on the other side. There would have been something ludicrous about these movements, but for the impression of horror that the swarm made upon Tommy and Jim Dodd. Hitherto both had supposed that the hideous insects acted by blind instinct, but now there could be no longer any doubt that they were possessed of an organized intelligence. The strident sounds grew louder. Already Tommy was beginning to discover certain variations in them. It was dawning upon them that they formed a language, and a perfectly intelligible one, for as the note changed about a half semitone, two of the monsters left with the side of their ruler and reached the two men with 3 successive leaps. Their movements left no doubt in either Tommy's or Dodd's mind which was required. The two strode hastily toward the assemblage and stopped as the antennae of their guards came down in menacing fashion. It was light enough for Tommy to see the face of the ruler of the hellish swarm, and it required all his powers of will to keep from collapsing at sheer horror in what he saw. For, despite the close-fitting shell, the face of the Beetle King was a face of a man. A white man. Jim Dodd's shriek ran out above the shrilling of the beetle legs. "Bram! It's you! Good heavens, it's you, Bram!" Ooh. Loud mic boom sounds, everyone's favorite. Chapter 4, Bram's Story. A sneering chuckle broke from Bram's lips. "Yes, it's me, James Dodd," he answered. "I'm a little surprised to see you here, Dodd, but I'm mighty glad. Still insane upon the subject of fossil monotremes, I suppose." The words came haltingly from Bram's lips, as those of a man who had lost the habit of easy speech. And Tommy, looking on, trying to keep in possession of his faculties, had already come to the conclusion that the sounds were inaudible to the beetles. Probably their hearing apparatus was not attuned to such slow vibrations of the human voice. Also, he discovered that the Bram was wearing the discarded shell of one of the monsters. He'd not grown the shell himself. It was fastened about his body by a band of the hair cloth, fastened to the two protuberances of the elytra or wing cases on either side of the dorsal surface. The discovery at least robbed the situation of one aspect of terror. Bram, however he had obtained control of the swarm, was still only a man. Yes, still insane," answered Dodd bitterly. "Insane enough to go on believing that the Polyprodontia and the Deciderae, which includes the Permidae or the bandicoots and the banded anteaters and the Myrmecobidae, are not to be found in fossil form for the excellent reason that they weren't represented before the Upper Cretaceous period." You lie, screamed Bram. "I've shown to all the world that that Physelotherium, Amphitherium, Ambulotherium, Spalacotherium, and many other orders are to be found in the Upper Jurassic rocks of England, Wyoming, and other places. You're the man who denied the existence of the Nototherium of the marsupial lion and Pleistocene deposits. You denied that the Dasyuriae can be traced back along the Pliocene, and you stand there and lie to me when you're at my mercy?"
For goodness sake, don't aggravate him,
whispered Tommy to Dodd.
Don't you see that he's insane? Humor him or we'll be dead men. Think what the world will lose if you're never able to go back with your specimens," he added craftily.
But Dodd, whose eyes were glaring, and said a sublime thing. "I've given my life to science, and I'll never deny my master." With a screech which, however, was evidently inaudible to the beetles, Bram leaped at Dodd and seized him by the throat. The two men fell to the ground, the ponderous beetle shell completely covering them. Underneath it they could be seen to be struggling desperately. All the while the beetle horde remained perfectly motionless. Tommy thought afterward that this in fact lay their brightest chances of escape if Bram's immediate vengeance didn't fall on them. Either because Bram was not himself a beetle, or because in some other way the swarm instinct was not stirred, the monsters watched the struggle with complete indifference. At the moment, however, Tommy was only concerned with saving Dodd from the madman. He got his foot beneath the shell, then inserted his leg, and using his whole body as a lever, he succeeded in turning Bram over on his back. Then and only then, the swarm rushed in upon them. Then Tommy realized he'd touched one of the triggers that regulated the beetle's automatism. In another instant, Bram would have been torn to pieces. The needle beaks were darting through the air, the hideous jaws were snapping. Bram's yells ran through the cavern. Dodging beneath the avalanche of monsters, Tommy got Bram upon his feet again. The beetles stopped, their every movement arrested. Bram's hand went to the pocket of his tattered coat. There came a snap and a flash. Bram had ignited an automatic cigarette lighter. Immediately, the monsters went scurrying away into the distance. And Tommy had another clue. The beetles living in the dimness of the underworld could not stand light or fire. He ran to where Jimmy was lying, face upward on the ground. His face was badly scarred by Bram's nails, and the blood was spurting from a long gash in his throat, made by the sharp flint that was lying beside him. He had some time before he discarded his fur coat. Now he pulled off his coat, and tearing off the tail of it with his shirt, he made a pad and a bandage, with which he attempted to staunch the blood and bind the wound. It must have taken 10 minutes before the failing heart force enabled him to get the bleeding under control. Dodd had nearly bled to death. His face was drawn and waxen, but because the pulsation was so feeble, the artery had ceased to spurt. Then only did Tommy take notice of Bram. He'd been squatting near, and Tommy realized that he'd been unconsciously observed Bram put some sort of pellets into his mouth. Now he realized that Bram was some sort of drug fiend. That was what had made him walk out of the Greystone camp in the storm. Bram got up and came toward them. "Is he dead?" he whispered hoarsely. I lost my temper. You two, I don't intend to kill you. There's room for the three of us. I've got plans of the utmost importance to humanity."
"I don't think much of the way you've started to carry them out,"
answered Tommy bitterly.
"No, he's not dead yet, but I wouldn't give much for his chances, even in the best hospital. The best thing you can do now is go to hell and take your beetles with you."
Bram, without replying, raised his head and emitted from his throat the shrillest whistle that Tommy had ever heard, and the response was amazing. Rasping out of the darkness came 8 beetles in pairs. Instead of leaping from an upright position, they trotted in the manner of horses, upon all fours, their shells, which touched at the edges forming a solid surface, gently rounded in the center so that a man's body could lie there and fit snugly into the groove. "Help me get him up," said Bram. "Trust me, I'll do my best for him. If we leave him here, they may kill and eat him. I can't trust all the beetle guards." Tommy hesitated a moment, then decided to follow Bram's suggestion. Together they raised the unconscious man to the beetle shell couch. Bram seated himself upon the boss of one of the beetle shells in front, and Tommy jumped up behind. Next moment, to his amazement, the trained steeds were flying smoothly through the air at a rate that couldn't have been less than 75 to 80 miles an hour. Tommy's shell seat wasn't a bed of roses, but he hardly noticed that. He was thinking that if Dodd lived, they should be able to turn the tables. For unknown to Bram, he was in possession of a cigarette lighter which he'd picked up, and which Bram, in his agitation, had forgotten. It was full of petrol or some other fluid of a similar nature, which Bram must have obtained from some natural source within the earth. In an emergency, Tommy knew that he had the means of keeping the beetles at bay. They had traveled for perhaps an hour when a faint light began to glow in the distance. It grew brighter, and a roaring sound became audible. A turn of the track that they were traversing, and the light became a glare. A terrific sight met Tommy's eyes. Out of the bowels of the earth, actually out of the crust beneath their feet, there shot a pillar of roaring flame of an intense white color and radiating a heat that was perceptible at even a distance of several hundred yards. The beetle steeds dropped gently to the ground and halted. Bram got down, grinning. "Nicely trained horses, what? By the way, you'll have the advantage of me in names. Who and what are you?" Tommy told him. "Well, Travers, it looks as if we're going to be companions for some time to come, and I quite admit you saved my life back there. So we don't want to start with secrets. This is a natural petrol string, which has probably been burning undiminished for ages. My trained beetles are blind. You didn't happen to notice I cut off their antenna? But the rest of the swarm daren't near come it. So that makes me their master." "Pretty neat trick, wah, Travers? I'm the Lord of the Flame down here, and I'm using my advantage. But don't get the idea of supplanting me. There's lots of other tricks you don't know anything about, and I'll have to trust you better before—" He broke off and slipped another pellet into his mouth. "Help me get Dodd down."
"Help me get Dodd down if this is our destination."
They lifted Dodd to the ground. He was conscious now and groaning for water. The two men carried him into a sort of large cavern, at the farther end of which the fire was roaring. Bram went to a spring that trickled down one side, filled something that looked like a petrified lily calyx, and brought it to Dodd, who drained it. Tommy looked about him. He was astonished to see that the place was, in a way, furnished. Bram had carved out a very credible couch, and several low chairs, evidently with a stone axe, for by the light of the fire, which cast a fair illumination even at that distance, Tommy could see the marks of the implement, rough and irregular, in the wood. On the ground were thick rugs woven of hair, and 2 or 3 rugs of the same material lay on the couch. It was evident that the human herd was expected to furnish textile materials as well as meat. "Sit down and make yourself comfortable," said Bram when they had raised Dodd to the couch. "We'll have dinner and then we'll talk. I can give you a fine vegetarian meal. Those dirty shrimp-eating savages look on me as a cannibal because I eat the fruits of the trees." He grinned. "There's a bad shortage of food in Submundy, as I've named this part of the world. For until I came the beetles simply devoured the humans wholesale, instead of breeding them like I taught them. And there's another of the 150 swarms due to hatch out soon. However, we'll talk about that later, and those fine fruits going to waste. Excuse me, Travers." He disappeared and returned in a minute or two with a small table, piled high with luscious fruits unknown to Tommy, though some of them looked like loaves of natural bread. Tommy, whose appetite never failed him even in the worst circumstances, fell to it with a will. He was enjoying his meal when he happened to look up and saw that the penumbra of the edge of the lighted zone was dense with beetles. Thousands, perhaps millions, for they stretched away as far as the eye could see, were packed together, their antennae waving in unison, their heads beneath the shells directed toward the fire. Bram saw Tommy's look of disgust and laughed. "The fire seems to intoxicate them, Travers. They always throng the entrance when I'm here. It's as far as they dare go. They're quite blind in the least light. Care to smoke? I've learned the art of making some quite decent cigars." He produced a handful. "Oh, by the way, you didn't see my lighter anywhere, did you?" he went on with a pretense of carelessness. "No, I was surprised you—" "Oh, there's a supply of petrol in the rocks, no matter," answered Bram carelessly. "Your friend looks bad," he added, glancing at Dodd, who had fallen asleep. "Travers, I'm sorry I lost my temper. The shock of meeting men from the upper world, you know." Dodd opened his eyes and tried to whisper, and Tommy bent over him and listened. "He wants to know whether he can have the girl to take care of him." "What, the one I saw you with? Why, she's a cull, Travers." "How do you mean?" "Why, useless, you know. There's several of them running loose and waiting to be rounded up. We raise 2 breeds, one for replenishing the stock and one for meat. She's a cull, a reversion. No use for either purpose. I'll have her brought by all means, though. I like Dodd. I want him to get to like me." Bram went on with a sort of penitence that had a pathetic touch. "Our little difference is quite absurd, and I can prove he's wrong in his ideas. Make yourself comfortable as long as you're here, Travers, and don't mind me. Only, don't try to escape. The beetles will get you if you do, and there's no way out of here. None that you'll find. And don't try to follow me. But you're a sensible man, and we'll get along famously, I'm sure, as soon as Dodd recovers." Chapter 5. Doomed. There were no means known to Tommy of reckoning time in that strange place of twilight. His watch had been broken in the airplane fall, and Dodd never remembered to wind his, but they estimated that about 2 weeks had passed, judging from the number of the times that they had slept and eaten anyway. In those 2 weeks, they'd gradually begun to grow accustomed to their surroundings. Haidita, the girl, had arrived on Beetleback within an hour after Bram's departure, apparently into the cleft of the rocks. How he'd communicated his order to the beetle steeds, Tommy had no idea. And under the girl's ministrations, Dodd was making good progress towards recovery. That Haidita was in love with Dodd in quite a human way was evident. To please the girl, both Dodd and Tommy had learned to eat the raw shrimps, which, being bloodless, were really no worse than oysters, and had a flavor halfway between shrimp and crawfish. To please the men, Hydida had tried not to shudder when she saw them devouring the breadfruit and nectarines of which Bram always had a plentiful supply. Bram was so solicitous in his inquiries for Dodd's health, however.
Jim, I've been thinking about our chances of getting away, said Tommy one morning. It's evident Bram is only waiting for your recovery to put some proposition up to us. Suppose you were to feign paralysis.
How do you mean? What for? Demanded Dodd.
If he thinks you're helpless, he'll be less on his guard. You haven't walked about in his presence anyway.
That was true, for the activities of the two had been nocturnal when Bram had vanished.
Let him think a nerve's been severed in your neck or something of the sort. If it doesn't work, you can always get better.
Dodd's realistic portrayal of a man with a partly paralyzed right side brought cries of horror from Bram the next morning. Solicitously, he helped Dodd back to his couch. Bram, when not under the influence of his drug, had moments of human feeling. Can't you move that arm and leg at all, Dodd? He asked. No feeling in them. There's plenty of feeling, growled Dodd, but they don't seem to work, that's all. You'll get better, said Bram eagerly. You must get better. I need you, Dodd, in spite of our differences. There's work for all of us, wonderful work. A new humanity waiting to be born, Dodd, not one of the miserable ape race, but of... He checked himself, and a cunning look came over his face. He turned away abruptly. At the end of 2 weeks or so, an amazing thing happened. One day, Hydida, with a look of triumph in her eyes, addressed Dodd with a few English words. Her brain, which had probably developed certain faculties in different proportions from the upper human race, had registered every word that either of the two men had ever spoken, and remembered it. As soon as Dodd ascertained this, he began to instruct her, and with her abnormal faculties of memory, it wasn't long before she could talk quite intelligently. The obstacle that stood between the two of them was swept away, and she became one of themselves. In the days that followed, the girl had told them, brokenly, something of the history of her race, of the legend of the universal flood that had driven them down into the bowels of the earth, of the centuries-long struggle with the beetles, and of the insect's gradual conquest of humanity, and the final reduction of the human race to a miserable, helpless remnant. Everywhere, Hydida told them, were beetle swarms. Everywhere humanity had been reduced to a few handfuls. Bram, by breeding mankind from prolific strains and using the newborn progeny for food, had temporarily averted universal starvation. But a new swarm of beetles was due to hatch out shortly, and then... The girl, with a shudder, put a hand to her bosom and brought out a little bright-eyed lizard. The old man you saw with me, who is one of our 4 wise elders, has told our people that these things feed upon the beetle larvae. We're putting them secretly into the nest, but what can a few lizards do against millions? In the earth above us, the beetle larvae extend for miles in a solid mass. When they come out as beetles, it'll be the end of all of us. Bram had grown less suspicious as time passed. His sudden visits to the cavern had ceased. Dodd and Tommy knew that he spent the nights, if they could be termed nights, lying in a drugged slumber somewhere among the rocks. They had asked Hydida whether there was any way of escape into the upper world. There are 2 ways from here. One is the way you came, but it's impossible to pass the beetle guards without being torn to pieces. The other... She shuddered and for an instant drew back the film from across her pupils, then uttered a little cry of pain at the light, dim though it was. There is a bridge across the terrible monster that devours all it touches, she said, shuddering, meaning the fire. Suddenly Dodd had an inspiration. He still had the fur coat that he'd worn, and reaching into a pocket, he pulled out a pair of snow goggles and adjusted them over Hydida's nose. Now look. Hydida looked, blinked, and with an effort, kept her eyes open. She gazed at Dodd in amazement. Dodd laughed and pulled her toward him. He kissed her, and Hydida's eyes closed. What is this? She murmured. First you give me medicine that opens my eyes, and then you give me medicine that closes them. That's nothing. Wait till you understand me better. Bram's eyes were preternaturally bright. It was evident that he'd been increasing his dose of late, and that he was fully under the influence of it now.
Well, gentlemen, the time has come for us to be frank with one another,
he said as the three were gathered about the little table, while Haidita crouched in a far corner of the cave.
I want you to work for me in my plans for the regeneration of humanity. The time for which I have long labored is almost at hand. Any day now, the new swarm of beetles may emerge from the pupal stage. But before I speak further, come and see them, gentlemen.
He rose, and Dodd and Tommy rose too, Tommy supporting Dodd, who let his arm and leg trail awkwardly as he moved. Bram led the way into the cleft among the rocks, into which he had been in the habit of passing. Beyond this opening, the two men saw another smaller cavern, with a beetle guard standing on either side, antenna waving. Bram shrilled a sound, and the antenna dropped. The three passed through. Tommy saw a haircloth pallet set against the rocks, a table, and a chair. Beyond was a sloping ramp of earth. Overhead was a rock ceiling. Bram led the way up the ramp, and the three stepped through a gap in the rocks and found themselves on an extensive prairie. But in place of the red grass, there was a vast sea of mud. By the light cast by the petrol fire, which roared up in the distance, a veritable fiery mountain, the two Americans could see that the mud was filled with long, huge, encysted forms, grubs 3 or 4 feet long, motionless in the soil. Bram scooped up one of them and tossed it into the air. It thudded at their feet and remained motionless.
As far as you can see, and for miles beyond, these pupae of the beetles lie buried in the decaying vegetation in which the eggs were hatched. Every century and a half, so far as I have been able to judge from comparative anatomy, a fresh swarm emerges. See?
He pointed to the pupa which he had unearthed, which, as if stirred into activity by his handling, was now beginning to move. Or rather, something was moving inside the cocoon. The shell broke, and the hideous head and folded antenna of a beetle appeared. With a convulsive writhing, the monster threw off the covering and stepped out. It extended its wings, glistening with moisture, from the still soft and pliant carapace, or shell, and suddenly zoomed off into the distance. Tommy shuddered as the boom of its flight grew softer and subsided.
Any day now, the entire swarm will emerge, cried Bram. How many moltings they undergo before they undergo the finished state, I don't know, but as you can see, they are prepared for the battle of life. They emerge ravenous. That beetle will fall upon the man-herds and devour a full-grown man, unless the guards destroy it. He raised his arms with the gesture of an ancient prophet. Woe to the human race, the wretched ape spawn that has cast out its teachers and persecuted those who sought to raise it to higher things.
Tommy knew that Bram was referring to himself. Bram turned fiercely upon Dodd.
When I joined the Greystroke expedition, he cried, it was with the express intention of refuting your miserable theories as to the fossil monotremes. I couldn't sleep or eat, so deeply I was affronted by them. For if they were true, the Decideri are an innovation in the great scheme of nature, and man, instead of being a mere afterthought, a jest of the creative force, came to earth with a purpose. That I deny. Man is a joke. Nature made him when she was tired, as the architect of a cathedral fashions a gargoyle in a sportive moment. It is the insect, not man, who is the predestined lord of the ages. And for once in his life, perhaps because at this point Tommy dug him violently in the ribs, Dodd had the sense to remain silent. Bram led the way swiftly back into the larger cave. When this swarm hatches out, I calculate there will be a trillion beetles seeking food. There's no food for a tithe of them here under the earth. What then, do you realize their stupendous power, their invincibility? No, you don't realize it, because your minds, though long habit, are only tuned to think in terms of man. All man's long history of slaughter and of the so-called lower creatures obsesses you, blinds your understanding. A beetle, something to be trodden underfoot, crushed in sport. But I tell you, gentlemen, that nature, God, if you will, has designed to supplant the man-ape by the beetle.
He's resolved to throw down the wretched so-called intelligence of your kind and mine and supplant it by the divine instinct of the beetle, an instinct that is infinitely superior because it arrives at results instantaneously. It knows where man infers. Attuned closely to nature, it alone is able to fulfill the divine plan of creation.
Bram was certainly under the influence of his drug, but nevertheless, so violent were his gestures, so inspired was his utterance, that Tommy and Dodd listened, almost in awe.
They are invincible. Their fecundity is such that when the new swarm is hatched out, their numbers alone will make them irresistible. They don't know fear, they shrink from nothing. And they'll follow me, their leader, who the means of hope controlling them. How then can puny man try to stand against them? Join me, gentlemen, and beware how you decide rashly, for this is the supreme moment, not only of your own lives, but for all humanity in beetledom. Upon your decision hang the future of the world. For irresistible as the beetles are, there's one thing they lack. That's the sense of historic continuity. If they destroy man, they'll know nothing of man's accomplishments, poor though these are. My own work on the fossil monotremes, which is a tissue of inaccuracies and half-baked assumptions. Bram startled as if a whip had lashed him. Liar! Do you think that I, who left the Gracebroke expedition in a howling blizzard because I knew here in the inner earth I could refute your miserable impostures, do you think that I am in the mood to listen to your wretched farrago of impossibilities? Listen to me, bawled Dodd, advancing with waving arms. Once and for all, let me tell you that your deductions are based upon fallacious premises. No, I will not shut up, Tom Travers. You want me to aid your darn beetles in the destruction of humanity. I tell you that your Pascalorium, Amphitherium, and all the rest of them, including the marsupial lion, are degenerate developments aged following the Pleistocene. I say the whole insect world was made to fertilize the plant world so that it should bear fruit for human food. Man is the summit of the scale of evolution. I will never join in any infamous scheme for his destruction.
Bram glared at Dodd like a madman. 3 times he opened his mouth to speak, but only inarticulate sounds came from his throat. And when at last he did speak, he said something that neither Dodd nor Tommy had anticipated.
It looks as if you're not so paralyzed as you made out. You'll change your mind within what used to be called a day, Dodd, and you'll crawl to my feet and beg for pardon. And you'll recant your lying theories about the fossil monotremes, or you die. The pair of you die.
My, things are heating up. So now we move into Chapter 6, Escape.
I heard what he said. You shall not die. We shall go away to your place where there are no beetles to eat us, even if...
Hydita shuddered.
Even if we have to cross the bridge of fire, beyond which they tell me lies freedom.
High over and a little to one side of the petrol flame, Dodd and Tommy had seen the slender arch of rock leading into another cleft in the rocks. They had investigated it several times, but always the fierce heat had driven them back. Both Dodd and Tommy had noticed, however, at times the fire seemed to shrink in volume and intensity. Observation had shown them that these times were periodical, recurring about every 12 hours.
I think I've got the clue, Tommy, said Dodd as the three watched the fiery mountain and speculated on the possibility of escape. That flow of petrol is controlled, just like the tides on Earth, by the pull of the moon. Just now it's at its height. I've noticed that it loses pretty nearly half its volume in its alternating phase. If I'm right, we'll make the attempt in about 12 hours.
Bram's given us 24, but how about getting Hydita across?
I go where you go, said Hydita, sidling up to Dodd and looking down upon him lovingly. I do not afraid of the fire. If it burns me up, I go to the good place. Where's that, Hydita? When we die, we go to a place where it is always dark and there are no beetles, and the ground is full of shrimps. We leave our bodies behind like the beetles and fly about happy forever. Not a bad sort of place, said Dodd, squeezing Hydita's arm. If you think you're ready to try and cross the bridge, we'll start as soon as the fire gets lower. I'll be on the job, answered Hydita, unconsciously reproducing a phrase of Tommy's.
The girl glided away and disappeared through the thick of the beetle crowd clustered about the entrance to the cavern. Tommy and Dodd had already discovered that it was through her ability to reproduce a certain beetle sound, meaning not good to eat, that the girl could come and go. They had once tried it on their own account and narrowly escaped the lashing tentacles. After that, there was nothing to do but wait. 3 or 4 hours must have passed when Bram returned from his inner cave. "Well, Dodd, have you experienced a change of heart? If you knew what was in store for you, maybe you'd come to the conclusion that you've been too cocksure about the monotremes. We're slaughtering in the morning." "That so?" asked Dodd. "That's so," shouted Bram. "The beetles are beginning to emerge from the pupae, and they'll need food if they're to be kept quiet. We're rounding up about 70 of the culls. Your friend Haidita will be among them. We've got some caged Ichinumon flies, pretty little things only a foot long, which will sting them in certain nerve centers, rendering them powerless to move. Then we shall bury them, standing up in the vegetable mold, for the beetles to devour alive as soon as they come out of the shells. You'll feel pretty, Dodd, standing there with being unable to move, with newborn beetles biting chunks out of you." Tommy shuddered, despite his hopes of their escaping. Bram, for a scientist, had a grim and picturesque imagination. "Dodd, there is no personal quarrel between us." Again, that note of pathetic pleading came into his voice. "Give up your mad ideas. Admit that the banded anteater at least existed before the Pleistocene epoch, and everything can be settled. When you see what my beetles are going to do to humanity, you'll be proud to join us. Only make a beginning. You remember the point I made in my paper about Spalacotherium in the Upper Jurassic rocks? It would convince anybody but a hardened fanatic. I read your paper, and I saw your so-called Spalacotherium reconstructed from what you call a jawbone. That so-called jawbone was a lump of chalk made porous by water, and the rest was in your imagination. Do your worst, Bram. I'll never crucify truth to save my life, and I'll laugh at your Spalacotherium when your beetles are eating me." Bram yelled and shrieked. He stamped up and down the cavern, shaking his fists at Dodd. At last, with a final turn of objurgation, he disappeared.
"A pleasant customer,"
said Tommy.
"We'll have to make that bridge, Jim, no question about it, even if it means death in the petrol fire."
"Fire's dying down fast," answered Dodd. "Haidita ought to be here soon."
"If Bram hasn't got her..."
"Bram got that girl? If Bram harms a hair on her head, I'll kill him with worse tortures than he's ever dreamed of," answered Dodd, leaping up white with rage.
"You mean you..."
"Love her? Of course I love her. She's 1 in a million, just the sort of helpmate I need to assist me in my work when we get back. I tell you, Tommy, I didn't know what love meant before I saw Haidita. Oh, I laughed at it as a romantic notion. 'Oh, lyric love, half angel and half bird,' he quoted, beginning to stride up and down the cavern, while Tommy watched him in amazement. And at this moment a complete beetle entered the cave. Complete because it had a plastron, or brush shell, as well as a back shell or carapace. A double brush shell. A new species of beetle? An executioner beetle, sent by Bram to summon them to the torture? Tommy shuddered, but Dodd, lost in his love ecstasy, was ignorant of the creature's advent. "Oh, lyric love," he shouted again, as he twirled on his heel to run smack into the monster. The crack of Dodd's head against the beetle shell re-echoed through the cave. The double plastron dropped, the carapace fell down, and Haidita stood revealed. The lovers, folded in each other's arms, passed momentarily into a trance. It was Tommy who separated them.
"We'll have to make a move. I think the fire's as low as it ever gets. Why did you bring the shells, Haidita?"
"To save us from all the beetles. When they see us in the shells, they will not know we're human. That what makes it so hard to have to be eaten by those beetles when they're such dumbles," she added, reproducing another of Tommy's words. "Come, let us see if we can pass the fire." The roaring fountain made the air a veritable inferno. Overhead, the rocks were red hot. A cascade of sparks tumbled in a fiery shower from the rock roof. Dodd, holding Haidita in his arms to protect her, staggered ahead with Tommy in the rear. Only the beetle shells, which acted as non-conductors of the heat, made the fiery passage possible. There was one moment when it seemed to Tommy as if he must let go and drop into the raging furnace underneath. He heard Dodd bawling fiercely in front of him, and nerved himself to a last effort, beating fiercely at his blazing hair. And then the heat was past, and he dropped unconscious upon a bed of cool earth beside a rushing river. He was vaguely aware of being carried in Dodd's arms, but a long time seemed to have passed before he grew conscious again. He opened his eyes in utter darkness, and Dodd was whispering in his ear, "Tommy, old man, how are you feeling now?"
All right, but how's Haidita?
"Still unconscious, poor girl. We've got to get out of here. I heard Bram yelling in the distance. He's discovered our flight. There may be another way out of the cave, and if so, he'll stop at nothing to get us. See if you can stand, but keep your head low. There's a low roof of rock above us."
There's water.
said Tommy, listening to the roar of the torrent that seemed to be rushing past them. "It's a stream. I'm pretty sure these shells will float and bear our weight. We've got to try. We've got to put everything to the touch now, Tommy. I'm going to lay Haidita on one of the shells and start her off. Then I'll follow and you can bring up the rear."
I'm with you,
said Tommy, getting upon his feet and uttering an exclamation of pain as, forgetful of Dodd's injunction, he let his head strike the rock roof overhead. In the darkness he felt the outlines of his beetle shell lying beside the torrent. He could hear Dodd in front of him, grunting as he raised Haidita's unconscious form in his arms and deposited her in her shell. Tommy got his own shell into the stream and held it there as the water swirled around it. "Ready?" he heard Dodd call. Before he could answer, there sounded from not far away, but yet strangely muffled by the rocks, Bram's bellow of fury. Bram was evidently fully drugged and beside himself. Inarticulate threats came floating through the rocky chamber. "Bram seems to have lost his head temporarily," called Dodd, laughing. "A madman, Tommy. He insists that the marsupial lion—"
Yes, I heard you telling him about it," answered Tommy. You handed it to him straight. However, more about the marsupial lion later. I'm ready."
"Then let her go," called Dodd, and his words were swallowed up by the sound of the hollow shell striking against the rocky bank as he launched his strange craft into the water. Tommy set one foot into the hollow of his shell and let himself go. Instantly, the shell shot forward with fearful velocity. It was all Tommy could do to balance himself, for it seemed more unstable than a canoe. Once or twice he thought he heard Dodd shouting ahead of him, but his cries were drowned in the rush of the torrent. Suddenly a light appeared in the distance. Tommy thought it was another of the petroleum fountains, and his heart seemed to stand still. But then he gave a gasp of relief. It was a cluster of luminous fungi, 10 or 12 feet tall, emitting a glow equal to that of a dozen 40-watt electric bulbs. By that infernal light, Tommy could see that the stream curved sharply. It was about 50 feet in width, and the low rock roof had receded to some 15 feet overhead. Instead of a tunnel, there was nothing on either side of them, but a vast tract of marshy ground, thinly coated with the red grass. As Tommy looked, he saw the shell that carried the unconscious body of Haidita strike the bank beside the phosphorescent growth. He could see the girl lying in the hollow of the shell, as pale as death, her eyes closed. Dodd was close behind, and as the swirl of the current caught his shell, he turned to shout a warning to Tommy. And Tommy noticed a singular thing, of which his sense of balance had already warned him, though he'd already given conscious thought up to the matter. The river was running uphill. Of course it was, since the center of gravity was in the shell of the earth and not in the center. But the shell of the earth was under their feet. Then Tommy hit on the solution to the problem. If the river was running uphill, that means they must be near the exterior of the earth. In other words, they'd passed the center of gravity. They must be within a mile or so of the exit from Submundia. Tommy was about to shout his discovery to Dodd when his shell crowded behind the two others at the base of the clump of fungi. Huge, straight, hollow stems they were, and with mushroom caps, and like all fungi, fly-blown, for Tommy could see worms nearly a foot in length crawling in and out of the porous stalks. The stench from the growth was nauseating and overpowering, utterly sickening.
Push off and let's get out of here.
Tommy called to Dodd, who was balancing his shell against the bank and trying to peer in Haidita's face. At that moment, he caught sight of something that made his blood turn cold. It was an insect fully 15 feet in height, 3 times that of a beetle lurking among the fungi. He saw a hugely elongated neck, a 3-cornered head with a pair of tentacles, and 2 pairs of legs as long as giraffes. But what gave the added touch of horror was that the monster, balancing itself on its hind legs, had its forelegs extended in the attitude of one holding a prayer book. That attitude of devotion was so terrible that Tommy uttered a wild cry of terror. At the same time, another cry broke from Dodd's lips. "Goodness gracious! A prying mantis!" he shouted, struggling madly to push off his shells and hydeidas. The next moment, as if shot from a catapult, the hideous monster launched itself into the air, straight toward them. To be concluded in the February number. What a cliffhanger! Wow! Well, it's been about an hour and a half. I would firmly suggest everyone get up and do some stretches if you've been sitting while you're listening to this. Get that blood moving. It's not good to sit still for that long, you know? Coming up next is The Cave of Horror by Captain S.P. Meek. Dr. Bird looked up impatiently as the door of his private laboratory in the Bureau of Standards swung open, but the frown on his face changed to a smile as he saw the form of the operative Carnes of the United States Secret Service framed in the doorway.
Hello, Carnes,
He called cheerfully.
Take a seat and make yourself at home for a few minutes. I'll be with you as soon as I finish getting this weight.
Carnes sat on the edge of a bench and watched with admiration the long, nervous hands and slim, tapering fingers of the famous scientist. Dr. Bird stood well over 6 feet and weighed 206 pounds stripped. His massive shoulders and heavy shock of unruly black hair combined to give him the appearance of a prize fighter, until one looked at his hands. Acid stains and scars could not hide the beauty of these mobile hands, the hands of an artist and a dreamer. An artist Dr. Bird was, albeit his artistry expressed itself in the most delicate and complicated experiments in the realms of pure and applied science that the world had ever seen, rather than in the commoner forms of art. The doctor finished his task of weighing a porcelain crucible, set it carefully into a desiccator, and turned to his friend.
What's on your mind, Carnes? You look worried. Is there another counterfeit on the market?
The operative shook his head.
Have you been reading those stories that the papers have been carrying about Mammoth Cave?
He asked. Dr. Bird emitted a snort of disgust. I read the first one of them, partway through on the strength of its being an Associated Press dispatch, he replied. But that was enough. It didn't exactly impress me with its veracity, and from a viewpoint of literature, the thing was impossible. I have no time to pore over the lubrications of an inspired press agent.
So you dismiss them as mere press agent work?
Certainly. What else could they be? Things like that don't just happen fortuitously as the tourist season's about to open. I suppose those yarns will bring the flocks of the curious to Kentucky, though. The public always responds well to sea serpent stuff.
Mammoth Cave has been closed to visitors for the season,
Carnes said quietly. What? Was there really something to those wild yarns? cried the doctor in surprise.
There was, and what more to the point, there still is. At least there's enough to it that I'm leaving for Kentucky this evening. I came here for the express purpose of asking you whether you wanted to come along. Bolton suggested I asked you. He said that the whole thing sounded to him like magic, and that magic was more in your line than ours. He made a request for your services, and I have it in my pocket now. Are you interested?
How does the Secret Service cut in on it? Asked the doctor. It seems to me it's a state matter. Mammoth Cave isn't a national park.
Apparently you haven't followed the papers. It was a state matter until the governor asked for federal funding and troops. Whenever the regulars get into trouble, the federal government is rather apt to get a hand in there.
I didn't know the regulars had been sent there. Tell me about the case.
Will you come along?
Dr. Bird shook his head slowly. I really don't see how I can spare the time, Carnes.
I'm in the midst of some work of the utmost importance, and it hasn't reached the stage where I can turn it over to an assistant yet."
"Then I won't bother you with the details,"
replied Carnes as he rose. "Sit down, confound you," cried the doctor. "You know better than to try to pull that on me. Tell me your case, and then I'll tell you whether I'll go or not. I can't spare the time, but if it's interesting enough."
Carnes laughed.
"All right, Doctor. I'll take enough time to tell you about it, even if you can't go. Do you know anything about it?"
"Oh dear, my mother is calling me. Sorry, Mom, I'm on the radio." "No, I read the first story halfway through and then stopped. Start at the beginning and tell me the whole thing."
"Have you ever been to Mammoth Cave?"
"No."
It, or rather they, for a while it was called Mammoth Cave, is really a series of caves. They're located in Edmonson County in central Kentucky on a spur railroad from Glasgow Junction on the Louisville and Nashville Railroad. They're natural limestone caverns with a customary stalagmite and stalactite formation, but they're unusually large and very beautiful. The caves are quite extensive. They're on different levels, so much so that a guide is necessary if one wants to enter them and be at all sure of finding the way out. Visitors are taken over a regular route. They're seldom allowed to visit portions of the cave off the routes. Large parts of the cave have never been thoroughly explored or mapped. So much for the scene. About a month ago, a party from Philadelphia who were motoring through Kentucky entered the cave with a regular guide. The party consisted of a man and his wife and their 2 children, a boy of 14 and a girl of 12. They went quite a distance back into the caves, and then, as the mother was feeling tired, she and her husband sat down, intending to wait until the guide showed the children some sights which lay just ahead and return to them. The guide and the children never returned.
"What happened?"
"No one knows. All that's known is the bare fact they haven't been seen since."
"A kidnapping case?"
Apparently not in the sight of later happenings, although this was at first thought to be the explanation. The parents did wait for some time. The mother says that she heard faint screams in the distance some 10 minutes after the guide and the children left. But they were very far away, and she isn't sure she heard them at all. At any rate, they didn't impress her at the time. When half an hour had passed, they began to feel anxious, and the father took a torch and started out to hunt for them. The usual thing happened. He got lost. When he failed to return, the mother, now thoroughly alarmed, made her way, by some uncanny sense of direction, to the entrance and gave the alarm. Half an hour later, a dozen search parties were on their way into the cave. The father was soon located not far from the beaten trail, but despite 3 days of constant search, the children weren't located. The only trace of them that was found was a bracelet which the mother identified. It was found in the cavern some distance from the beaten path, and was broken as though by violence. There were no other signs of a struggle. When the bracelet was found, the kidnapping theory gained vogue, for John Harrell, the missing guide, knew the cave well, and natives of the vicinity scouted the idea he might be lost. Inspired by the large reward offered by the father, fresh parties began to explore the unknown portions of the cave. And then came the second tragedy. 2 of the searchers failed to return. This time there seemed to be little doubt of violence, for screams and a pistol shot were faintly heard by their searching, together with a peculiar screaming howl as it was described by those who heard it. A search was at once made toward the spot where the bracelet had been picked up, and the gun of one of the missing men was found within 50 yards of the spot where the bracelet had been discovered. 1 cylinder of the revolver had been discharged.
"Were there any signs on the floor?"
The searchers said that the floor appeared to be rather more moist and slimy than usual, but that was all. They also spoke of a very faint smell of musk, but this observation was not confirmed by others, who happened to arrive a few moments later.
"What happened next?"
The governor was appealed to, and a company of the National Guard was sent from Louisville to Mammoth Cave. They took up camp at the mouth of the cave and prevented anyone from entering. Soldiers armed with service rifles penetrated the caverns but found nothing. Visitors were excluded, and the guardsmen established regular patrols and sentry posts in the cave, with the result that one night, when time came for a relief, the only trace they could found of one of the guards was his rifle. It hadn't been fired. Double guards were then posted, and nothing happened for several days, until another sentry disappeared. His companion came rushing out of the cave screaming. When he recovered, he admitted that both he and the missing man had gone to sleep,
and he awoke to find his comrade gone. He called, and he says that the answer he received was a peculiar whistling noise that raised all the hair on the back of his neck. He flashed his electric torch all round, but couldn't see anything. He swears, however, that he heard a slipping, sliding noise approaching him, and he felt that someone was looking at him. He stood it for as long as he could, and then threw down his rifle and ran for his life.
Had he been drinking?
No, and it wasn't some sort of delirium either, shown by the fact that a patrol found his gun where he'd thrown it, but no trace of the other sentry. After this second experience, the guardsmen weren't very eager to enter the cave, and the governor asked for regulars. A company of infantry was ordered down from Fort Thomas to relieve the guardsmen, but they fared worse than their predecessors. They lost 2 men on their first night of the guard. The regulars weren't caught napping, for the main guard heard 5 shots fired. They rushed a patrol to the scene and found both the rifles which had been fired, but the men were gone. The officer of the day made a thorough search of the vicinity and found, some 200 yards from the spot where the sentries had been posted, a crack in the wall through which a body of a man could be forced. This body crack had fresh blood on either side of it. Several of his men volunteered to enter the hole and search, but the lieutenant wouldn't allow it. Instead, he armed himself with a couple of hand grenades and electric torch and entered. That was last Tuesday, and he hasn't returned.
Was there any disturbance heard from the crack?
None at all. A guard was posted with 2 machine guns pointed at the crack in the wall, and a guard of 8 men and a sergeant stood there. Last night, about 6 o'clock, while the guard were sitting around their guns, a faint smell of musk became evident. No one paid a great deal of attention to it, but suddenly, for no apparent reason at all, one of the men on guard was jerked in the air, feet upwards. He gave a scream of fear, and an unearthly screech answered him. The guard, with the exception of 1 man, turned tail and ran. 1 man stuck by his gun and poured a stream of bullets into the crack. The retreating men could hear the rattle of the gun for a few moments. Then there was a choking scream, followed by silence. When the officer of the day got back with the patrol, there was a heavy smell of musk in the air, and a good deal of blood was splashed around. The machine guns were both there, although it looked like one of them was twisted up until it looked like it had been through an explosion. The officer commanding the company investigated the place, ordered all men out of the cave, and communicated with the War Department. The Secretary of War found it too tough a nut to crack and asked for help, so that's why Bolton sent me down there. Do you think, in your view of this yarn, that your experiences can wait? The creases on Dr. Bird's high forehead had grown deeper and deeper as Carnes told his story, but now they suddenly disappeared, and he jumped to his feet with a boyish grin. How soon are we leaving? In 2 hours, Doctor. A car is waiting for us downstairs, and I have reservations booked for us both on the Southern tonight. I knew that you were coming. In fact, the request for your services had been approved before I came here to see you. Dr. Bird rapidly divested himself of his laboratory smock and took a coat and a hat from a cupboard. I hope you realize, Carnes, you old dear, he said as he followed the operative out of the building, that I have a real fondness for your worthless old carcass. I'm leaving the results of 2 weeks of patient work alone and unattended to help you out of trouble, and I know it'll be ruined when I get back. I wonder if you're worth it. Bosh! I'm mighty glad that you had to have you along, but you needn't rub it in by pretending it's affection for me that's dragging you reluctantly into this mess. With an adventure like this ahead of you, leg irons and handcuffs couldn't keep you away from Mammoth Cave, whether I was going or not. It was late afternoon before Dr. Bird and Carnes dismounted from the special train, which had carried them from Glasgow Junction to Mammoth Cave. They introduced themselves to the major commanding the guard battalion, which had been ordered down to reinforce the single company, which had borne the first brunt of the affair, and then interviewed the guards which had been routed by the unseen horror which was haunting the famous cave. Nothing was learned which differed in any great degree from the tale which Carnes had related to the doctor in Washington, except that the last officer of the day who had investigated the last attack failed to entirely corroborate the smell of musk which had been reported by the other observers. Well, it might have been musk, but to me it smelled differently. Were you ever near a rattlesnake den in the West? Dr. Bird nodded. Then you know the peculiar reptilian odor such a place gives off. Well, this smell was somewhat similar, by no means the same.
It was musky, all right, but it was more snake than musk to me. I rather like musk, but this smell gave me the horrors. Did you hear any noises? Not at all. The men described some rather peculiar noises. Sergeant Jervis is an old file and pretty apt to get things straight. They may have been made by the men who were in trouble. I saw a man caught by a bow in South America once. Noises he made might very well have been described in almost the same words Jervis used. Thank you, Lieutenant. I'll remember what you've told me. Now I think we'll go into the cave. My orders are allowed no one to enter, Doctor. I beg your pardon. Carnes, where's that letter from the Secretary of War? Carnes produced the document. The lieutenant examined it and excused himself. He returned in a few moments with the commanding officer.
In the face of that letter, Dr. Bird, I have no alternative to allowing you to enter the cave, but I'll warn you that it's at least at your own peril. I'll give you an escort if you wish.
If Lieutenant Pierce will come with me as a guide, that'll be all I need. The lieutenant paled slightly, but threw back his shoulders. Do you wish to start at once, sir? In a few moments. What's the floor of the cave like where we're going? Quite wet and slimy, sir. Very slippery? Yes, sir. In that case, before we go, I want to put on some baseball shoes with cleats in, so we can run if we have to. Can you get us anything like that? In a few moments, sir. Good. As soon as we can get them, we'll start. In the meantime, may I look at that gun that was found? The Browning machine gun was laid before the doctor. He looked it over critically and sniffed delicately at it. He took from his pocket a phial of liquid, moistened a portion of the water jacket of the weapon, and then rubbed the moistened part briskly with his hand. He sniffed again. He looked disappointed and examined the gun closely. Carnes, do you see anything on this gun that looks like tooth marks?
Nothing, Doctor.
Neither do I. There are some marks here which might quite conceivably be fingerprints of a 40-foot giant, and those two parallel grooves look like the result of severe squeezing, but there aren't any tooth marks. It's strange. And there's no persistent odor on the gun, which is also strange. There's no use in theorizing, though. We're confronted by a condition and not a theory, as someone once said. Let's put on those baseball shoes and see what we can find out. Dr. Bird led the way into the cave, Carnes and the lieutenant following closely with electric torches. In each hand, Dr. Bird carried a phosphorus hand grenade. No other weapons were visible, although the doctor knew Carnes carried a 45 caliber automatic pistol strapped under his left armpit. As they passed into the cave, the lieutenant stepped forward to lead the way. I'm going first. Follow me and indicate the turns by the pressure on my shoulder. Don't speak after we've started and be ready for instant flight. Let's go. Forward into the interior of the cave, they made their way. The iron cleats of the baseball shoes rang on the floor, and the noise echoed back and forth between the walls, dying out in little eerie whispers of sound that made Carnes' hair rise. Ever forward they pressed, the lieutenant guiding the doctor by silent pressure on his shoulder, and Carnes following closely. For half-mile they went on until a restrainable pressure brought the doctor to a halt. The lieutenant pointed slightly and silently toward a crack in the wall before them. Carnes started forward to examine it, but a warning gesture from the doctor stopped them. Slowly, an inch at a time, the doctor crept forward, hand grenades at readiness. Presently he reached the crack and, shifting one of the grenades from his pocket into his pocket, he drew forth an electric torch and sent a beam of light through that crack into the dark interior of the earth. For a moment he stood thus, and then suddenly snapped off his torch and straightened up in an attitude of listening. The straining ears of Carnes and Lieutenant Pierce could hear a faint slithering noise coming toward them, not from the direction of the crack, but from the interior of the cave. Simultaneously, a faint, musky, reptilian odor became apparent. Run! Run! It's loose in the cave! The lieutenant turned and fled at top speed toward the distant entrance to the cave, Carnes at his heels. Dr. Bird paused for an instant, straining his ears, and then threw a grenade. A blinding flash came from the point where the missile struck, and a white cloud rose in the air. The doctor turned and fled after his companions. Not for nothing had Dr. Bird been an athlete of note in his college days. Despite the best efforts of his companions, who were literally running for their lives,
He soon caught up with them. As he did so, a weird, blood-curdling screech rose from the darkness behind them. Higher and higher in pitch the note rose until it ended suddenly in a gurgling grunt, as though the breath which uttered it had been suddenly cut off. The slithering, rustling noise became louder on the trail. "Faster!" gasped the doctor as he put his hand on Karn's shoulder and pushed him forward. The noise of pursuit gained slightly on them, and a sound as of intense breathing became audible. Dr. Bird paused and turned, and faced the oncoming horror. His electric torch revealed nothing, but he listened for a moment, then threw his second grenade. Keenly he watched its flight. It flew through the air for 30 yards, and then struck an invisible obstruction and bounded towards the ground. Before it struck the downward motion ceased, and it rose in the air. As it rose, it burst with a sharp report, and a wild scream of pain filled the cavern with a deafening roar. The doctor fled again after his companions. By the time he overtook them, the entrance of the cave loomed before them. With sobs of relief, they burst out into the open. The guards sprang forward with raised rifles, but Dr. Bird waved them back. "There's nothing after us, men. We got chased a little ways, but I tossed our pursuer a handful of phosphorus, and it must have burned its fingers a little, judging from the racket he made. At any rate, it stopped the pursuit." The major hurried up.
Did you see it, Doctor?
"No, I didn't, nor has anyone ever seen it or anything like it. I heard it, and from its voice, I think it has a bad cold. At least it sounded hoarse, so I gave it a little white phosphorus to make a poultice for its throat. but I didn't get a glimpse of it."
For goodness sake, Doctor, what is it?
"I can't tell you yet, Major. So far as I can tell, it's something new to science. I'm not sure just what it looks like. However, I hope to be able to show it to you shortly. Is there a telegraph office here?"
No, but we have a signal corps detachment with us. They have a portable radio set which will put us in touch with the Army net.
"Good. Can you place a tent at my disposal?"
Certainly, Doctor.
"All right, I'll go there. And I'd appreciate it if you'd send the radio operator to me. I want to send a message to the Bureau of Standards to forward me some apparatus I need."
I'll attend to it, Doctor. Have you any special advice to give me about the guarding?
"Yes. Have you or can you get any livestock?"
Livestock?
"Yes, cattle preferred, although hogs or sheep will do in a pinch. Sheep will do quite well, actually."
I'll see what I can do, Doctor.
"Get them by all means if it's possible to do so. Don't worry about paying for them. Secret Service funds are not subject to the same audit that Army funds get. If you can locate them, drive a couple of cattle or half a dozen sheep well into the cave and tether them there. If you don't get them, have your sentries posted well away from the cave mouth, and if any disturbance occurs during the night, tell them to break and run. I hope it wouldn't come out, but I can't tell." A herd of cattle was soon located, and 2 of the beasts were driven in the cave. 2 hours later, a series of horrible screams and bellowings were heard in the cave. Following their orders, the sentries abandoned their posts and scattered, but the noise came no nearer the mouth of the cave, and in a few minutes, silence reigned again. "I hope that'll be all that'll be needed for a couple of days," said the doctor to the commanding officer. "But you'd better have a couple more cattle driven in the morning. We want to keep the brute well fed. Is there a tank stationed at Fort Thomas?"
No, there isn't.
"Then radio Washington. I want the fastest 3-man tank the Army has to be sent here at once. Don't bother with the military channels. Radio direct to the Adjutant General, quoting the Secretary of Treasury's authority. Tell him it's a rush matter and sign the message Bird if you're afraid of getting your tail twisted." Twice more before the apparatus which the doctor had ordered from Washington arrived, cattle were driven into the depths of the cave, and twice were the screams and bellowings from the cave repeated. Each time, search parties found the cattle gone in the morning. A week after the doctor's arrival, a special train came up, carrying 4 mechanics from the Bureau of Standards, together with a dozen huge packing cases. Under the direction of the doctor, the cases were unpacked and the apparatus put together. Before the assembly had completed, the tank, which had been requested, arrived from Camp Meade, and the Bureau mechanics began to install some of the assembled units in it. The first apparatus, which was installed in the tank, consisted of an electric generator of peculiar design, which was geared to the tank motor. The electromotive force thus generated was led across a spark gap, with points of a metallic substance. The light produced was concentrated by a series of parabolic reflectors directed against a large quartz prism, and thence through a lens which was designed to throw a slightly divergent beam. This apparatus, Dr. Bird explained to the Signal Corps operator, who was an interested observer, is one which was designed at the Bureau for large-scale production of ultraviolet light. There's nothing special about the generator, except that it's highly efficient and gives an almost constant electromotive force. The current thus produced is led across these points, which are composed of magna-alloy, a development of the Bureau. We found on investigation that a spark gave out a light which was particularly rich in ultraviolet rays when it was passed between magnesium points. However, such points could not be used for the handling of steady current because of the lack of durability and ease of fusion, so a mixture of graphite, aluminum, and metallic magnesium was pressed together with a binder which will stand the heat. Thus we get the triple advantages of ultraviolet light production, durability, and high resistance. The system of reflectors catches all of the light thus produced except for the relatively small portion which goes initially in the right direction and directs it on this quartz prism where, due to the refractive powers of the prism, the light's broken up into its component parts. The infrared rays in that portion of the spectrum which lies in the visible range, that is from red to violet inclusive, are absorbed by a black body, leaving only the ultraviolet portion free to send a beam through this quartz lens.
I thought a lens would absorb ultraviolet light, objected the signal officer.
A lens made of glass, perhaps, but this lens is made of rock crystal, which is readily permeable to ultraviolet light. The net result of this apparatus is that we can direct before us, as we move in the tank, a beam of light which is composed solely of the ultraviolet portion of the spectrum.
In other words, an invisible light?
Yes, that is to say, the invisible to the human eye. The effect of this beam of ultraviolet light in the form of severe sunburn would be readily apparent if you exposed your skin to it for any length of time, and the effects on your eyesight of continued gazing would be apt to be disastrous. It would produce a severe ophthalmia and temporary impairment of the vision, somewhat the same symptoms as are observed in snow blindness.
I see. May I ask what the object is of the whole thing?
Surely. Before we can successfully combat this peculiar visitant from another world, it's necessary that we gain some idea of the size and appearance of it. Nothing of the sort before has made its appearance, so far as the annals of science go, so I'm supposed to make some rather wild guesses at the nature of the animal. You're probably aware of the fact that the property of penetration possessed by all waves is a function of their frequency, or perhaps should I say of their wavelength?
Well, certainly.
The longer rays of visible light will not penetrate as deeply into a given substance as the shorter ultraviolet rays. This visitor is evidently from some unexplored and indeed unknown cavern in the depths of the earth where visible light has never penetrated. Apparently in this cavern the color of the inhabitants is ultraviolet and hence invisible to us.
You're kinda out of my depth here, Doctor.
Pardon me. You understand, of course, what color is, right? When sunlight, which is a mixture of all colors from infrared to ultraviolet inclusive, falls on an object, certain rays are reflected and certain others are absorbed. If the red rays are reflected and all others absorbed, the object appears red to our eyes. If all the rays are reflected, the object appears white, and if they're all absorbed, it appears black.
Well, yes, I understand that. It's almost elementary.
The human eye cannot detect ultraviolet. Suppose, then, that we have an object, either animate or inanimate, the surface of which reflects only ultraviolet light. What will be the result? Well, the object will be invisible, of course.
I should think it'd be black if all the rays except the ultraviolet were absorbed.
It would, but Mark, I didn't say the others were absorbed. Are you familiar with fluorescent?
No.
I think you are. It's the dye used in making changeable silk. If we fill a glass container with a fluorescent solution and look at it by reflected light, it appears green. If we look at it by transmitted light, that is, light which has traversed the solution, it appears red. In other words, this is a substance which reflects green light, allows a free passage to red light, and absorbs all other light. This creature we're after, if my theory is correct, is composed of a substance which allows free passage to all the visible light rays, and at the same time reflects ultraviolet light. Does that make sense?
well, perfectly good sense, I suppose.
Very well, then. My apparatus will project forward a beam of ultraviolet light which will be in much greater concentration than exists in an incandescent electric light. It's my hope that this light will be reflected by the body of the creature to a sufficient enough degree to allow me to make a photograph of it. But won't your lens prevent the ultraviolet light from reaching your plate? Yet again, an ordinary lens made of optical glass would do that, but I have a camera here equipped with a rock crystal lens which allows ultraviolet light to pass through it practically unhindered and with very slight distortion. When I add that I will have my camera charged with X-ray film, a film which is peculiarly sensitive to the shorter wavelengths, you'll see that I have a fair chance of success.
Well, it sounds logical. Would you allow me to accompany you when you make your attempt?
I'll be glad of your company if you can drive the tank. I want to take Carnes with me, and the tank will only hold two besides the driver.
Well, I mean, I can drive a tractor.
In that case, you should master the tricks of tank driving in short order. Get familiar with it, and we'll appoint you as driver. We'll be ready to go in tonight, but I'm going to wait a day. Our friend was fed last night, and there's less chance he'll be about.
The early part of the next evening was marked by howls and screams coming from the mouth of the cave. As the night wore on, the noises were quite evidently coming nearer and nearer, and the sentries watched the cave mouth nervously, ready to bolt and scatter according to their orders at the first alarm. About 2 a.m., the doctor and Carnes climbed into the tank beside Lieutenant Leffingwell, and the machine moved slowly into the cave. A searchlight on the front of the tank lighted the way for them, and attached to the frame, which held some distance ahead of them, was a luckless sheep.
Excuse me.
Keep your eye on the mutton, Carnes, cautioned the doctor. As soon as anything happens to it, shut off the searchlight and let me try to get a picture. As soon as I've made my exposures, I'll tell you, and you can snap it on again. Lieutenant, when the picture's made, turn your tank and make for the entrance of the cave. If we're lucky, we'll get out.
Forward the tank crawled, the sheep bleeding and trying to break loose from the bonds which held it. It was impossible to hear much over the roar of the motor, but presently Dr. Bird leaned forward, his eyes shining. I smell musk, he announced. Get ready for action. Even as he spoke, the sheep was suddenly lifted into the air. It gave a final bleat of terror, then its head was torn from its body. Quick, Carnes! The searchlight went out, and Carnes and the lieutenant could hear the slide of the ultraviolet light, which Dr. Bird was manipulating open. For 2 or 3 minutes, the doctor worked with his apparatus. All right, lights on and get us out of here. Carnes snapped on the searchlight, and Lieutenant Leffingwell swung the tank around and headed for the cave mouth. For a few feet, their progress was unhindered, and then the tank ceased its forward motion, although the motor still roared and the track still slid on the cave floor. Carnes watched with horror as one side of the tank bent slowly in towards him. There was a rending sound, and a portion of the heavy steel fabric was thrown away. Dr. Bird bent over something on the floor of the tank. Presently, he straightened up and threw a small object in the darkness. There was a flash of light, and bits of flaming phosphorus flew in every direction. The anchor which held the tank was suddenly loosed, and the machine crawled forward at full speed, while a roar of escaping air mingled with the bellowing shriek burdened the smoke-laden air. Faster! Cried the doctor, as he threw another grenade. Lieutenant Leffingwell got the last bit of speed possible out of the tank, and they reached the cave mouth without further molestation. I had an idea that our friend wouldn't care to pass through a phosphorus screen, said Dr. Bird with a chuckle as he climbed out of the tank. He must have been rather severely burned the other day, and once burned is usually twice shy. Where's Major Brown? The commanding officer stepped forward. Drive the couple cattle into that cave, Major. I want to fill the brood up and keep them quiet for a while. I'm going to develop my films. Lieutenant Leffingwell and Carnes peered over the doctor's shoulder as he manipulated his films in a developing bath. Gradually, vague lines and blotches made their appearance on one of the films, but the form was
indistinct at best. Dr. Bird dropped the films in a fixing tank and straightened up. "We have something, gentlemen, but I can't tell you yet how clear it is. It'll take those films 15 minutes to fix, and then we'll know." In a quarter of an hour, he lifted the first film from the tank and held it to the light. The film showed a blank. With an exclamation of disappointment, he lifted a second and third film from the tank with the same result. Then he raised the fourth one. "Good heavens!" gasped Carnes. In the plate could be plainly seen the hindquarters of the sheep, held in the grasp of a monster, such as even the drug-laden brain of an opium smoker never pictured. Judging from the sheep, the monster stood about 20 feet tall, and its frame was surmounted by a head resembling an overgrown frog. Enormous jaws were open to seize the sheep, but to the amazement of the three observers, the jaws had no teeth. Where teeth were to be expected, long, parallel ridges of what looked like bare bone appeared, without even a rudimentary segregation into teeth. The body of the monster was long and snake-like, and was borne on heavy legs, ending in feet with 3 long toes, armed with vicious claws. The crowning horror of this feature was its forelegs, however. They were of enormous length, thin and attenuated looking, and ended in huge misshapen hands, knobby and blotched, which grasped the sheep in the same manner as human hands would. The eyes were as large as dinner plates, and they were glaring at the camera with an expression of fiendish malevolence, which made Carnes shudder. How does that huge thing even get through the crack we examined?" Dr. Bird rubbed his head thoughtfully. "Well, it's not an amphibian, as it's plainly shown by the shape of the limbs and lack of a tail, yet it appears to have the scales of a true fish type. It corresponds to no recovered fossils, and I'm inclined to believe it's unique. The nervous organization must be very low, judging from the lack of forehead and the general conformation, but it has enormous strength, and at the same time the arms look feeble. There's no way it could get through that crack," insisted the lieutenant. "Apparently not. Wait a moment, though. Look at this." He pointed to the great disproportion between the length and diameter of the forelegs, and then to the hind legs. "Either this is some very grave distortion, or there's something very queer about that conformation. No animal could be constructed like that." He turned the film so an oblique light fell on it. As he did, he gave a cry of astonishment. "Look here! It does get through that crack. Just look at its arms and hands. There's the answer. The creature's tall and broad, but from the front to rear it can only measure a few inches. The same must be true of the frog-like head. That animal has been developed to live and move in a low-roofed cavern, and to pass through openings only a few inches wide. Its bulk is in all in 2 dimensions." "Why, I believe you're right," said Carnes as he studied the film. "There's no doubt of it. Look at those paws too, Carnes. That substance isn't bone, it's gum. The thing is so young and helpless it hasn't cut its teeth yet. It must be a baby. That's the reason why it made its way into the cave when no other of its kind ever has." "Good heavens! How large are full-grown ones if this is the baby?" asked the lieutenant. "Well, we certainly don't know, but I hope we don't have to face one and find out. Now that we know what we're fighting, however, we might be able to settle its hash." "Perhaps with a high explosive?" asked the lieutenant. "I don't think so. With such a low nervous organization, we'd have to tear it practically to pieces to kill it, and I'm anxious to keep it from mutilation for scientific study. I have an idea, but I'll have to study a while before I'm sure of the details. Send me the radio operator." The next day, the Bureau mechanics began to dismount the apparatus from the tank and to assemble another elaborate contrivance. Before they had made an end of the work, additional equipment arrived from Washington, which was incorporated in the new setup. At length, Dr. Bird pronounced himself ready for the attempt. Under his direction, 3 cattle were driven into the cave and there tethered. They were there the next morning unharmed, but the second night the now familiar bellowing and howling came from the depths of the cave, and in the morning 2 of the cattle were gone. "That should keep him quiet for a day or 2, and now we can go to work." The tank made its way into the cave, dragging after it 2 huge cables which led to an engine-driven generator outside the cave. These cables were attached to the terminals of a large motor, which was set up in the cave near the place where the cattle were customarily tethered. This motor was the accentuating force which turned 2 generators, one large and one small. The smaller one was mounted on a platform on wheels, which also contained the spark gaps, the reflectors, and other apparatus which produced the beam of ultraviolet light which had been used to photograph the monster earlier. From the larger generator led 2 copper bars. One of these was connected to a huge copper plate which was laid flat on the floor of the cave. The other led to a platform which was erected on huge porcelain insulators some 15 feet above the floor. Huge condensers were set up on this platform, and Dr. Bird announced himself in readiness. A steer was dragged into the cave and up a temporary runway, which led to the platform containing the condensers, and there tied with a copper bus bar from the larger generator fastened to the 3 flexible copper straps, which led around the animal's body. When this had been completed, everyone except the doctor, Carnes, and Lieutenant Leffingwell, who left the cave. These 3 crouched behind the searchlight, which sent a mild beam of ultraviolet into the platform where the steer was held. The engine outside the cave was started, and the 3 men waited with tense nerves. For several hours, nothing happened. The steer tried from time to time to move, and finding it impossible, set up plaintive bellows for liberty. I do wish something would happen. This is getting on my nerves. Something is about to happen. Listen to that steer. The bellowing of the steer had suddenly increased in volume, and added to a note of discontent was a note of fright which had previously been absent. Dr. Bird bent over his ultraviolet searchlight and made some adjustments. He handed a helmet-like arrangement to each of his companions and slipped one on over his head. I can't see
a thing, Doctor,
said Carnes in a muffled voice. The objects at which you're looking will absorb rather than reflect ultraviolet light, said the doctor. This is a sort of fluoroscope arrangement, and it isn't perfect at all. However, when the monster comes along, I'm pretty sure that you'll be able to see it. You may see a little more as your eyes get accustomed to it. I can see very dimly, announced the lieutenant in a moment. Dimly, the walls of the cave and platform then began to take vague shape in front of them. The 3 stared intently down the beam of ultraviolet light, which the doctor directed down the passageway leading deeper into the cave. Good heavens! Ejaculated Carnes suddenly. Slowly into the field of vision came the hideous figure they'd seen on the film. As it moved forward, a rustling, slithering sound could be heard, even over the bellowing of the steer and the hum of the apparatus. The odor of musk became evident. Along the floor toward them the thing slid. Presently it reared up on its hind legs, and its enormous bulk became evident. It turned somewhat sideways, and the correctness of Dr. Bird's hypothesis as to its peculiar shape was proved, while the bulk of the creature was in 2 dimensions. Forward it moved, and the horrible human hand stretched forward as well, while the mouth split in a wide, toothless grin. Nearer the doomed steer the creature approached, and then the reaching hand closed on the animal. There was a blinding flash, and the monster was hurled backward, as though struck by a thunderbolt, with a terrible smell of musk and burned flesh filled the air. "After it, quick!" cried the doctor as he sprang forward. Before he could reach the prostrate creature, it moved, and then, slowly at first, but with rapidly gaining speed, slithered over the floor in retreat. Dr. Bird's hand swung through an arc, and there was a deafening crash as a hand grenade exploded on the back of the fleeing monster. An unearthly scream came from the creature, and its motion changed from a steady forward glide to a series of convulsive jerks. Leffingwell and Carnes threw grenades, but they went wide of their mark, and the monster again began to increase its speed. Another volley of grenades was thrown, and one hit scored, which slowed the monster somewhat, but didn't arrest the steady forward movement. "Any more bombs?" demanded the doctor. "Ugh. The current wasn't strong enough. It's going to get away." Carnes jerked his automatic from his armpit and poured a stream of bullets into the fleeing monster. Slower and slower the motion of the creature became, and its movements again became jerky and convulsive. "Keep it in sight. We may get it yet." Cautiously, the three men followed the retreating horror, laughing while pushing before him the platform holding the ultraviolet ray apparatus. The chase led them over the familiar ground. There's the crack! Too late, replied the doctor. He rushed forward and seized the lower limb of the monster, and tried with all his strength to arrest its flight. But despite all he could do, it slid sideways through the crack in the wall and disappeared. A final backward kick of its leg threw the doctor 20 feet against the far wall of the cave.
Are you hurt, Doctor?
No, I'm all right. Put on your mask. Start the gas. Quick. That may stop it before it gets in far. The three adjusted gas masks and thrust the mouths of 2 gas cylinders which were on the light truck into the crack and opened the valves. The hissing of gas was accompanied by a thrashing, writhing sound from the bowels of the earth for a few minutes, but the sound retreated and finally died away into utter silence. And that's that, cried the doctor, half an hour later as they took off their gas masks outside the cave. It got away from us. Carnes, how soon can we get a train back to Washington?
What kind of a report are you going to make to the Bureau, Doctor?
Asked Carnes as they sat in the smoker of a southern train headed for the capital. I'm not going to put in any report, Carnes, replied the doctor. I haven't got the creature or any part of it to show, and no one would believe me. I'm going to maintain a discreet silence about the whole matter.
But you have your photograph to show, Doctor, and you have my evidence and Lieutenant Leffingwell's.
The photograph may have been faked, and I may have doped both of you. In any case, your words are no better than mine. No, indeed, Carnes. When I failed to make the current strong enough to kill it outright, I made the first of moves which bind me to silence, although I thought the 200,000 bolts would be enough. The second failure I made was when I missed him with my second grenade, although I doubt if all 6 would have stopped him. My third failure was when we failed to get a sufficient concentration of cyanide gas into that hole in a hurry. The thing is so badly crippled it may die, but it'll take hours or even days for it to do so. It's already made its way so far into the earth we couldn't reach it by blasting without danger of bringing the whole place down on our heads. Even if we could blast our way into the place, it came from where I wouldn't dare open a path, which would allow only Lord knows what terrible monsters to invade the earth. When the soldiers have finished stopping that crack with 10 feet of solid masonry, I think the barrier will hold even against that critter's papa and mama and all its relatives. Then the Mammoth Cave should be safe for visitors again, at least relatively so. That latter fact is the only report which I will make.
It's a dandy story which will go to waste,
said Carnes soberly. Tell it then if you wish, and get laughed at for your pains. No, Carnes, you must learn one thing. A man like Bolton, for instance, will implicitly believe that a 4-leaf clover in his watch charm will bring him good luck, and that carrying a buckeye keeps rheumatism away from him. But tell him a bit of sober fact like this, attested by 3 reliable witnesses or in a good photograph, and you'll just get laughed at for your pains. I'm keeping my mouth shut.
So be it then.
All right. So that is our second story of the day.
Ooh, maybe a good time to take a good stretch. I certainly am. Actually, now that I think of it, I am going to put on a short advertisement while I go to grab some water. Hopefully it doesn't take too... Hopefully I don't leave you guys too long in the silence before we start Phantoms of Reality by Ray Cummings. So I shall return. I need more water.
Want to learn more about the Stinger? Visit us online at www.sau.edu/KALA. That's www.sau.edu/KALA. The Stinger, Beats by Bees on KALA HD3.
Essentra Credit Union wants to be your BFF, best financial friend. You got enough on your mind during the school year? So we'll help make managing your college finances a little easier. Our freebie checking accounts will get your money right. You get a Visa debit card with no minimum balance or maintenance fees. And with over 5,000 shared branches nationwide, your Essentra membership lets you manage your money from anywhere. Perfect for college life. Essentra's My Mobile app lets you transfer funds, pay bills, and even deposit checks from your smartphone. And our Pop Money service lets you send and receive money from friends. No more hassling over the late night pizza bill. We can also help you pay for college. The Essentra Scholarship Program awards $10,000 in scholarships every year, or take advantage of our private student loans. Either way, we've got your back. Become a member owner today. #LikeABoss. Details at Essentra.org. Listening, caring, doing what's right. We are Essentra Credit Union.
Oh my. What a coincidence. That was almost the perfect amount of time. Just a few seconds. Isn't that pleasant? Better than leaving it on for far too long. So, on that note, we'll move to the third story of the January issue, called Phantoms of Reality. It's by Ray Cummings. Chapter 1, Wall Street or the Open Road? When I was some 15 years old, I once made the remark, "Why, that's impossible." The man to whom I spoke was a scientist. He replied gently,
My boy, when you've grown older and wiser, you'll realize that nothing is impossible.
Somehow that statement stayed with me. In our swift-moving, wonderful world, I've seen it proven many times. They once thought it impossible to tell what lay across the world, or across the broad, unknown Atlantic Ocean. They thought the vault of the heavens revolved around the earth. It was impossible for it to do anything else because they could see it revolve. It was impossible, too, for anything to be alive and yet so small that one couldn't see it. But here's the microscope proving to the contrary. Or once again, to talk beyond the normal range of the human voice was impossible, until the telephone came to show how simply and easily it might be done. I never forgot that physician's remark, and it was repeated to me some 10 years later by my friend, Captain Derek Mason, on that memorable June night of 1929. My name is Charles Wilson. I was 25 that June of 1929. Although I had lived all my adult life in New York City, I had no relatives there, and few friends for that matter. I had known Captain Mason for several years. Like myself, he seemed one who walked alone in life. He was an English gentleman, perhaps 30 years old. He had been stationed in the Bermudas, I understood, though he rarely spoke of it. I always felt that I'd never seen so attractive a figure of a man as this Derek Mason. An English aristocrat, he was straight, tall, and dark, and rather rakish, with a military swagger. He affected a small black mustache. A handsome, debonair fellow with an easy grace of manner. A modern D'Artagnan? I have no idea who that is. D'Artagnan. That's, someone from the 1930s, I don't know, I suppose. In an earlier, less civilized age, he would have been expert with sword and stick, I would not doubt. A man who could capture the hearts of women with a look. He had always been to me a romantic figure, and a mystery that seemed to shroud him made him no less so. A friendship had sprung up between Derek Mason and me, perhaps because we were such opposite types. I was an American of medium height and medium build, ruddy with sandy hair. Derek Mason was as meticulous of his clothes, his swagger uniforms the most perfect view Brummel. Not myself. I'm careless of dress and speech. I hadn't seen Derek Mason for at least a month, when, one June afternoon, a note came from him. I went to his apartment at 8 o'clock the same evening. Even about his home there seemed a mystery. He lived alone with one manservant. He had taken quarters in a high-class bachelor apartment building near Lower Fifth Avenue, at the edge of Greenwich Village. All of which no doubt was rational enough, but in this building he had chosen the lower apartment of the ground floor level. It adjoined the cellar. It was built for the janitor, but Derek had taken it and fixed it up in luxurious fashion. Near it, in a corner of the cellar, he'd boarded off a square space into a room. I understood vaguely that it was a chemical laboratory, but he'd never discussed it, and nor had I ever been shown inside it. Unusual, mysterious enough, and that a captain of the British military should be an experimental scientist was even more unusual. Yet I always believed that for a year or two, Derek had been engaged in some sort of chemical or physical experiment. With all his military swagger, he had the precise, careful mode of thought characteristic of the man of scientific mind. I recall that when I got his note with its few sentences bidding me to come see him, I had a premonition that marked the beginning of something strange, as though the portals of mystery were opening to me. Nothing is impossible. Nevertheless, I record these events into which I was plunged in that June evening with a very natural reluctance. I expect no credibility. If this were the year 2000, despite it being the year 2017, my narrative doubtless would be tame enough. We'll see. Yet in 1929 it can be only called a fantasy. Let it go at that. The fantasy of today is the sober truth of tomorrow. And by the day after it is a mere platitude. Our world moves swiftly. Derek received me in his living room. He admitted me himself. He told me that his manservant was out and about. It was a small room with a leather-covered easy chair, rugs on the hardwood floor, and sober brown portieres at its doors and windows. A brown parchment shade shrouded the electrolier on the table. It was the only light in the room. It cast its mellow sheen upon Derek's lean, graceful figure as he flung himself down and produced cigarettes. He said, "Charlie, I want to have a little talk with you. I've something to tell you, something to offer you." He held his lighter out to me with its tiny blue alcohol flame under my cigarette, and I saw that his hand was trembling. "But I don't understand what you mean," I protested. He retorted, "I'm suggesting that you might be tired of being a clerk in the brokerage office, tired of this humdrum we call civilization, tired of Wall Street." I am, Derek. Heavens, that's true enough. His eyes held me. He was smiling half whimsically. His voice was only half serious. Yet I could see in the smoldering depths of those luminous dark eyes a deadly seriousness that belied his smiling lips and unserious tone. He interrupted me with, "And I offer you a chance for the deeds of high adventuring, the romance of danger, of pitting your wits against villainy to make right triumph over wrong, and to win for yourself power and riches. And perhaps a fair lady." "Derek, you talk like a swashbuckler or someone from the Middle Ages." I thought he'd grin, but he turned suddenly solemn. "I'm offering to make you a henchman to a king, Charlie." "King of what? Where?" He spread his lean brown hands with a gesture. He shrugged. "What matter? If you seek adventure, you can find it. Somewhere. If you feel the lure of romance, it will come to you." I said, "Henchman to a king?" But still he wouldn't smile. "Yes, if I were king. Serious. Absolutely. In all this world, there's no one who cares a darn about me. Not in this world, but..." He checked himself. He went on, "You're the same. You have no relatives?" "Well, no, none that ever think of me." "Nor a sweetheart, have you?" "No. Well, not yet. Maybe never." "But you're too interested in Wall Street to leave it for the open road? Or do you fear the deeds of daring? Do you want to right a great wrong, rescue an oppressed people, overturn the tyranny of an evil monarch, put your friend and the girl he loves upon the throne? Or do you want to go down to work as usual in the subway tomorrow morning? Are you afraid that this process of becoming henchman to a king you may perchance, get killed? I matched his caustic tone. Let's hear it, Derek. Chapter 2, The Challenge of the Unknown. Incredible! Impossible! I didn't say it, though my thoughts were written on my face, no doubt. Derek said quietly, Difficult to believe, Charlie? Yes, but it happens to be true. The girl I love is not of this world, but she lives nevertheless. I've seen her, talked with her, a slim little thing, beautiful. He sat, staring. This is nothing supernatural, Charlie. Only the ignorant savages of our past called the unknown, the unusual, supernatural. We know better now. This girl, as I've told you, I have for years been working on the theory that there's another world existing here in the same space with us. The fourth dimension. Call it that if you like. I found it, proved its existence. And this girl, her name is Hope, lives in it. Let me tell you about her and her people, shall I? My heart was pounding so it almost smothered me. Yes, Derek. She lives here in this space we call New York City. She and her people use the same space at the same time that we use it. A different world from ours, existing here now with us. Unseen by us and we are unseen by them. A different form of matter, Charlie. As tangible to the people of the other realm as we are to our own world. Humans, like ourselves. He paused, but I couldn't find any words to fill the gap. And presently he went on. Hope's world, coexisting here with us, is dependent upon us. They speak what we call English. They shadow us. Phantoms of reality. Yes, a world very like ours, but primitive, where ours is civilized. He paused again. His eyes were staring past me as though he could see through the walls of the cellar room into the great reaches of the unknown. What a strange mixture was this Derek Mason. What a strange compound of the cold reality of the scientist and the fancy of the romantic dreamer. Yet I wonder if that is not what science is. There's no romantic lover gawping at the moon who could have more romance in his soul, or see in the moonlit eyes of his loved one more romance than the scientist finds in the wonders of his laboratory. Derek went on slowly. A primitive world, a primitive nation, primitive passions. As I see it now, Charlie, as I know it to be, it seems as though Hope's world is merely a replica of ours, stripped to the primitive, as though it might be the naked soul of our modern New York, ourselves as we really are, not as we pretend to be. He roused himself from his reverie. Hope's nation is ruled by a king, an emperor, if you like. A monarch beset with the evils of luxury and ease, and wine and women. He's surrounded by nobles, the idle aristocracy, by virtue of their birth, proclaiming themselves too fine of a clay to work. The crimson nobles they're called, because they affect crimson cloaks, and their beautiful women, voluptuous, are wont to bedeck themselves in veils and robes of crimson. And there are workers, toilers they call them, oppressed, downtrodden toilers, with a hate for the nobles and the king smoldering within them. In France there was such a condition, and the bloody revolution came of it. It exists here now. Hope was born in the ranks of these toilers, but has risen by her grace and beauty to a position in the court of this graceless monarch. He leapt from his chair and began pacing the room. I sat silent, staring at him. So strange a thing? Impossible? I couldn't say that. I could only say incredible to me. And as I framed the thought, I knew its incredibility was the very measure of my limited intelligence, my lack of knowledge. The vast unknown of nature, so vast that everything which was real to me, understandable to me, was a mere drop in the ocean of existing unknown. Don't you understand me now? Derek added vehemently. I'm not talking fantasy, merely cold reality. I've found a way to transport myself, and you for that matter, into this different state of matter into the other world. I already made a test. I went there and stayed for just a few moments, a night or so ago. It made my heart leap wildly. He went on. There is chaos there, smoldering revolution at which any time, tonight perhaps, may burst into conflagration and destroy the wanton ruling class. In Hope's world, the workers are primitive, ignorant people. Superstitious. They're all primed and ready to shout for any leader who sets himself up. My chance, our chance. He suddenly stopped his pacing and stood before me. Don't you feel the lure of it? The open road? The road is straight before me and the red gods call for me. I'm going, Charlie, going tonight, and I want you to go with me. Will you? Would I go? The thing leaped at me like a menacing shadow, risen solidly to confront me. Would I go? Suddenly, there was before me the face of a girl, white, apprehensive. It seemed almost pleading. A face beautiful with a mouth of parted red lips. A face framed in long, pale golden hair with big staring blue eyes. Wistful eyes wan with starlight. Eyes that seemed to plead. I thought, this is madness. I wasn't seeing this face with my eyes. There was nothing. No one here in the room with me but Derek. I knew it. The shadows about us were empty. They had to be. I was conjuring the face only from Derek's words, making real that which existed only in my imagination. Yet I knew that in another realm, with my thoughts now bridging the gap, the girl was real. Would I go into the unknown? The quest to the unknown, the gauntlet of the unknown, now flung down before me, as it was flung down before the ancient explorers who picked up its challenge and mounted the swaying decks of their little galleons and said, we'll go and see what lies off in the unknown. That same lure was on me now. I heard my voice saying, why, yes, I'll go, Derek. Chapter 3, Into the Unknown. We stood in the boarded room, which was Derek's laboratory. Our preparations had been simple. Derek had made them all in advance. There was little left to do. The laboratory was a small room of board walls, board ceiling, and floor as well. Windowless, with a single door opening into the cellar of the apartment house. Derek had locked the door after us as we entered. He said, I've sent my manservant away for a week. The people in the house here think I've gone away on a vacation. No one will miss us, Charlie. Not for a time, anyway. No one would miss me, save my employers, and to them I doubt I would be any small loss. We put out the light in Derek's apartment and locked it carefully after us. This journey, I own that I was trembling and frightened, yet a strange eagerness was on me. The cellar room was comfortably furnished. Rugs were on its floor. Whatever apparatus of a research laboratory had been here was removed now, but the evidence of it remained. Derek's long search for the secret which he was now about to use. A row of board shelves at one side of the room showed where bottles and chemical apparatus had stood. A box of electrical tools and odds and ends of wire still lay discarded in the corner of the room. There was a tank of running water and gas connections, where no doubt Bunsen burners had been. Derek produced his apparatus. I sat on a low, small couch against the wall and watched him as he stripped himself of his clothes. Around his waist he adjusted a wide, flat, wire-woven belt. A small box was fastened to it in the middle of the back, a wide, flat thing of metal, 1/4 of an inch thick, and curved to fit his body. It was a storage battery of the vibratory current he was using. From the battery, tiny threads of wire ran up his back to a wire necklace flat against his throat. Other wires extended down to his arms, the wrists. Still others down his legs to the ankles. A flat electrode was connected to the top of his head like a helmet. I was reminded as he stood there of medical charts of the human body with the arterial system outlined. But when he dressed again and put on his jaunty captain's uniform, only the electrode clamped to his head and the thin wires dangling from it, in the back were able to disclose there was anything unusual about him. He said, smilingly, "Don't stare at me like that." I took a grip on myself. This thing was frightening, now that I'd actually embarked on it. Derek had explained to me briefly the workings of his apparatus. A vibratory electric current, for as which he had yet had no name, was stored in the small battery. He said, "There's nothing incomprehensible about this, Charlie. It's merely a changing of the vibration rate of the basic substance out of which our bodies are made. Vibration is the governing factor of all states of matter, after all. In its essence, what we call substance is wholly intangible. That is already proven. A vortex, a whirlpool of nothing. It creates a pseudo-substance, which is the only material in the universe, and from this, by vibration, is built the complicated structure of things as we see and feel them to be, all dependent upon vibration. Everything is altered, directly as the vibratory rate is changed, from the most tenuous gas to fluids and solids, throughout all the different states of matter. The only fundamental difference is the rate of vibration." In fairness, they are kind of onto something if you look into quantum field theory. Isn't that something? I understood the basic principle of this that he was explaining, that now when this electronic current which he had captured and controlled was applied to our physical body, the vibration rate of every smallest and most minute particle of our physical being was altered. There's so little in the vast scale of natural phenomena which our human senses are cognizant. Our eyes see the colors of the spectrum from red to violet, but there's a vast, invisible world of color lies below the red of the rainbow. Physicists call it the infrared, and beyond the violet, another realm, the ultraviolet. With sound it is the same. Our audible range of sound is relatively small. There are sounds with too low a vibratory rate for us to hear, and others too rapid. The differing vibratory rate from the most tenuous gas to the most substantial solid is all that we can perceive in this physical world of ours. Yet of the whole, it is so very little. This other realm to which we were now going lay in the higher, more rapid vibratory scale. To us, by comparison, a more tenuous world, a shadow realm. I listened to Derek's words, but my mind was already on the practicality of what lay ahead. An explorer, standing upon his ship, may watch his men bending the sails, raising the anchor, but his mind flings out to the journey's end. We were soon ready. Derek wore his jaunty uniform, and I wore my ordinary business suit. A magnetic field would be about us, so that in the transition anything in fairly close contact with our bodies was affected by the current. Derek said, "I'll go first, Charlie." "But, Derek..." A fear greater than the trembling I'd felt before leapt at me, left here alone with no one on whom to depend. He spoke with careful casualness, but his eyes were burning me. "Just sit there and watch. When I'm gone, turn on the current as I showed you and come after me. I'll wait for you." "Where?" I stammered. "Here. Right here. I'm not going away. Not going to move. I'll be on the couch waiting for you," he said with a faint smile. Terrifying words. He had lowered the couch, bending out its short legs until the frame of it rested on the board floor. He drew a chair up before it and seated me, and sat down on the couch. "Oh, and one other thing. Just before you start, put out the light. We can't tell how long it'll be before we return." Yet more terrifying words. His right hand was on his left wrist where the tiny switch was placed. He smiled again. "Good luck to us, Charlie." Good luck to us. The open road, the unknown, was all that lied before us. I sat there staring. He was partially in shadow. The room was very silent. Derek lay propped up on one elbow, and his hand through the tiny switch. There was a breathless moment. Derek's face was set and white, but no whiter than my own, I was sure. His eyes were fixed on me. I saw him suddenly quiver and twitch a little. I murmured, "Derek." At once he spoke to reassure me. "I'm all right, Charlie. That was just the first feel of it." There was a faint quivering throb in the room, like a tiny, distant dynamo throbbing. The current was surging over Derek, and his legs twitched. A moment. The faint throbbing intensified. No louder, but more rapid, infinitely more rapid. A tiny throb, an aerial whine, faint as the whirring wings of a hummingbird. It went up the scale, ascending in pitch, until presently it was screaming with an aerial, microscopic voice. But there seemed no change in Derek. His uniform was glowing a trifle, and that was all. His face was composed now. He smiled, but he didn't speak. His eyes roved away from me, as though now he was seeing things I couldn't see. Another moment, and there was no change. Why, what was this? I blinked, I gasped. There was a change. My gaze was fastened upon Derek's white face. White? It was more than white now. A silver sheen seemed to be coming to his skin. I think no more than a minute has passed. His face was glowing, shimmering. A transparent look was coming to it, a thinness, a sudden unsubstantiality. He dropped his elbow and lay on the couch, stretched at full length at my feet. His eyes were staring. And suddenly I realized that the face that held those staring eyes was erased. A shimmering apparition of Derek was stretched here before me. I could see through it now. Beneath the shimmering, blurred outlines of his body, I could see the solid folds of the couch cover. A ghost of Derek here. An apparition, fading, dissipating. A gossamer outline of him, imponderable, intangible. I leapt to my feet, staring down over him. Derek! The shape of him didn't move. Every instant it was more vaporous, more unreal. I thought, he's gone. No, he was still there. A white mist of his form on the couch, melting, dissipating in the light like a fog before sunshine. A wisp of it left like a breath, and then there was nothing. I sat on the couch. I'd put out the light. Around me the room was black. My fingers found the small switch at my wrist, and I pressed it across its tiny arc. The first shock was slight, but infinitely strange. A shuddering, twitching sensation ran all over me. It made my head reel, swept a wave of nausea over me, and a giddiness, a feeling that I was falling through darkness. I lay on the couch, bracing myself. The current was winding up its tiny scale. I could feel it now. A tiny throbbing, communicating itself to my physical being. And then in a moment I realized my body itself was throbbing. The vibration of the current was communicating itself to the most minute cells of my body, an indescribable tiny quivering within me. Strange, frightening, sickening at first. But the sickness passed, and in a moment I almost found it pleasant. I could see nothing. The room was wholly dark. I lay on my side of the couch, my eyes staring into the blackness around me. I could hear the humming of the current, and then it seemed to fade. Abruptly, I felt a sense of lightness. My body, lying on the couch, pressed less heavily. I gripped my arm. I was solid, substantial as before. I touched the couch. It was the couch which was changing, not I. The couch covers queerly seemed to melt under my hand. The sense of my own lightness grew upon me. A lightness, a freedom pressed me, as though chains and shackles which all my life had encompassed me were falling away. A wild, strange freedom. I wondered where Derek was. Had I arrived in the other realm? Was he here? I had no idea how much time had passed. A minute or two, perhaps. Or was I still in Derek's laboratory? The darkness was solid, as impenetrable as ever. No, not quite dark. I saw something now. A glowing, misty outline around me. Then I saw it was not the new, unknown realm, but still Derek's room. A shadowy, spectral room, and the light which dimly illumined it was from outside. I lay, puzzling, my own situation forgotten for the moment. The light came from overhead in another room of the apartment house. I stared. Around me now was a dim vista of distance and vague, blurred, misty outlines of the apartment building above me. The shadowy world I had left now laid bare. There was a moment when I thought I could see far away across the spectral city street. The shadows of the great city were around me. They glowed and then they were gone. A hand gripped my arm in a solid grip. Derek's voice sounded. "Are you all right?" Yes, I murmured. The couch had faded. I was conscious that I had floated or drifted down a few inches to a new level. The level of the cellar floor beneath the couch. Cellar floor? It wasn't that now. But there was something solid here, a solid ground, and I was lying upon it, with Derek sitting beside me. Yes, I'm all right. My groping hand felt the ground. It was soil with a growth of vegetation like a grass sward on it. Were we outdoors? It certainly seemed so. I could feel soft, warm air on my face and had a sense of open distance around me. A light was growing, a vague, diffused light, as though day were swiftly coming upon us. I felt Derek fumbling at my wrist. That's all, Charlie. There was a slight shock. Derek was pulling me up beside him. I found myself on my feet, with light around me. I stood wavering, gripping Derek. It was as though I closed my eyes, and then they were suddenly open. I was aware of daylight, color, and movement. A world of normality here, normal to me because I was a part of it. The realm of the unknown. Don't adjust your sets, folks. Just grabbing a little bit of water. Chapter 4. Hope I Came. I think I was first conscious of a queer calmness which had settled upon me, as though now I had withdrawn contact with the turmoil of our world. Something was gone, and in its place came a calmness. But that was merely a transition. It had passed in a moment. I stood, trembling with eagerness, as I know Derek was trembling. A radiant effulgence of light was around us, clarifying and growing. There was ground beneath our feet and sky overhead. A rational landscape, but strangely familiar. Sorry about that. Let's hope those hiccups don't persist. A rational landscape, strangely familiar. A physical world like my own. Oh, there's another one. A physical world like my own, but it seemed with a new glory upon it. Nature, calmly serene. I had thought we were standing in daylight. I saw now that it was bright starlight. An evening, such as the evening we had just left in our own world. The starlight showed everything clearly, and I could see a fair distance. We stood at the top of a slight rise. I saw a gentle, slightly undulating country. A brook nearby wound itself through a grove of trees and lost itself. With a shock, I realized how familiar this was. We stood facing in what New York City we call West. The contour of this land was familiar enough for me to identify it. A mile or so ahead lay a river. It shimmered in its valley with cliffs on either side. Near at hand, the open country was dotted with trees and checkered with round patches of cultivated fields, and there were occasional habitations, low oval houses of green thatch. The faint flush of a recent sunset lay upon the landscape, mingled with the starlight. A road, a white ribbon in the starlight, wound over the countryside toward the river. Animals, strange of aspect, were slowly dragging carts, and there were distant figures working in the fields. A city lay ahead of us, set along the nearer bank of the river. A city? It seemed a primitive village. All was primitive, as though here might be some lost Indian tribe of our early ages. The people were picturesque, the field workers garbed in vivid colors, the flat little carts slow-moving with broad-horned oxen. This quiet village, drowsing behind the calm flowing river, seemed all very normal. I could fancy it was just after sundown of a quiet workday. There was a faint flush of pink upon everything. The glory of the sun just set. And as though to further my fancy, in the village by the river, like an angelus, a faint toned bell was chiming. We stood for a moment, gazing silently. I felt wholly normal. A warm, pleasant wind fanned my hot face. The sense of lightness was gone. This was normality to me. Derek murmured, "Hope was to meet me here." And then we both saw her. She was coming towards us along the road. A slight, girlish figure clothed in queerly vivid garments, a short jacket of blue cloth with wide flowing sleeves, knee-length pantaloons of red with tassels dangling from them, and a wide red sash across her waist. Pale golden hair was piled in a coil upon her head. She was coming toward us along the edge of the road from the direction of the city. She was only a few hundred feet from us when we first saw her, coming swiftly, furtively it seemed. A low pike fence bordered the road. Hold on, I seem to have lost my spot. There we go. A low pike fence bordered the road. She seemed to be shielding herself in the shadows beside it. We stood waiting in the starlight. The nearest figures in the field and on the road were too far away to notice us. The girl advanced. Her white arm went up in a gesture, and Derek answered. She left the road, crossing the field toward us. As she came closer, I saw how very beautiful she was. A girl of 18 or 19, perhaps. A fantastic little figure with her vivid garments. The starlight illumined her white face, anxious, apprehensive, yet eager. "Derek," he said. "Hope." I came. I stood silently, watching. Derek's arms went out, and the girl, with a little cry, came running forward and threw herself into them. Chapter 5. Intrigue. "Am I in time, Hope?" "Yes, but the festival's tonight. In an hour or two now. Oh, Derek, if the king holds the festival, the toilers will revolt. They won't stand it." "Tonight? It mustn't be held tonight. It doesn't give me time to plan." I stood, listening to their vehement, half-whispered words. For a moment or two, absorbed, they ignored me. "The king will make his choice tonight, Derek. He's announced it. Blanca or Sentua for his queen. And if he chooses the Crimson Sentua, if he does, there will be bloodshed. The toilers are waiting just to earn his choice." "But tonight is too soon. I've got a plan. Hope, where does Robar stand in this?" Strange intrigue. I pieced it together now from their words and from what they presently briefly told me. A festival was about to be held, an orgy of feasting and merrymaking, of music and dancing. And during it, the young king Leotono was to choose his queen. There were two possibilities: the Crimson Sentua, a profligate, debauched woman who, as queen, would further oppress the workers, and Blanca, a white beauty risen from the toilers to be a favorite at the court. Hope was her handmaiden. If Blanca were chosen, the toilers would be appeased. She was one of them. She'd lead this king from his profligate ways, would win from him justice for the workers. But Derek and Hope both knew that the pure and gentle Blanca would never be the king's choice. And tonight the toilers would definitely know of it, and a smoldering revolt would burst into flame. And then there was this Robar. Derek said, "He's the king's henchman, Charlie." I stood in the starlight listening to them. This strange, primitive realm. There was no modern weapons here, and we hadn't brought any ourselves. The current used in our transition would have exploded the cartridges of a revolver. I had a dirk, which Hope now gave me, and that was all. Primitive intrigue. I envisaged this chaotic nation, with its toilers ignorant as the people at their worst, striving to better themselves, yet not knowing how, ready to shout for any leader who might, with vainglorious words, set himself up as a patriot. This Robar, perhaps, was planning to do just that, and so was Derek. He said, "Hope, if you could persuade the king to postpone the funeral, Hope, if you could persuade the king to postpone the festival, if Blanca might help persuade him, just until tomorrow night." "I can try, Derek, but the festival is planned for an hour or two from now." "Where's the king?" "In his palace near the festival gardens." She gestured to the south. My mind went back to New York City. This hillock where we were standing in the starlight beside a tree was in my world about 5th Avenue and 16th Street. The king's palace, Festival Gardens, stood down at the Battery, where the rivers met in the broad water of a harbor.
And Derek was saying, "We haven't much time. Can you get us to the palace?"
Yes, I have a cart down there on the road.
"And the cloaks for Charlie and I?"
Yes.
"Good. We'll go with you. It's a long chance. He probably won't postpone it. If he doesn't, we'll be among the audience. And when he chooses the red Sentua..."
Oh, Derek.
I thought I heard her whisper,
Oh, Alexandra.
and I saw his finger go to his lips. His arm went around her, and she huddled small as a child against his tall, muscular body. He said gently, "Don't be afraid, little Hope." His face was grim, but his eyes were gleaming. I saw him suddenly as an instinctive military adventurer, an anachronism in our modern New York City, born in a wrong age. But here in this primitive realm, he was at home. I plucked at him.
How can we dare plunge into this thing? Hidden with cloaks. Yeah, but you talk of leading these toilers.
He cast Hope away and confronted me. "I can do it. You'll see, Charlie." He was very strangely smiling. "You'll see. But I don't want to come into the open right away. Not tonight. But only if we can postpone this accursed festival." We'd been talking perhaps 5 minutes. We were ready now to start away. Derek said, "Whatever comes, Charlie, I want you to take care of Hope. Guard her for me, will you?"
Yes, I'll try to.
Hope smiled as she held her hand out to me.
I won't be afraid with Derek's friend.
Her English was of a different intonation from our own, but it was a native language of hers, that I couldn't doubt. I took her cold, slightly trembling hand. "Thank you, Hope." Her eyes were misty with starlight, tender eyes, but the tenderness was not for me. "Yes, you can depend on me, Derek." We left the hillock. A food-laden cart came along the road. The driver, a boy vivid in jacket and wide trousers of red and blue, bravely worn but tattered, ran alongside, guiding the oxen. When they'd passed, we followed, and presently we came to the cloaks Hope had hidden. Derek and I donned them. They were long crimson cloaks with hoods.
Hope said, "Many are gathering for the festival shrouded like that. You won't be noticed now."
Further along the road, we reached a little eminence. I saw the river ahead of us and a river behind us, and a few miles to the south, an open spread of water where the rivers joined. Familiar contours, the Hudson River, East River, and down at the end of the island, New York Harbor. Hope gestured that way.
The king's palace is there.
We were soon passing occasional homes, primitive thatched dwellings, and I saw inside one. Workers were seated over their frugal evening meal. Always the same vivid garments, jaunty but tattered. We passed one fellow in a field, working late in the starlight. A man bent with age, but still a tiller of the soil. Hope waved to him and he responded, but the look he gave us as we hurried by, shrouded in our crimson cloaks, was sullenly hostile. We came to an open cart. It stood by the roadside. An ox with shaggy coat and spreading horns was fastened to the fence. It was a small cart with small rollers like wheels. Seats were in a vivid canopy over it. I climbed in and rumbled away. And this starlit road in our own world was Broadway. We were presently passing close to the river's edge. This peaceful, quiet, starlit river. Why, in our world it was massed with docks. Great ocean liners, huge funneled story decks lay here. Under this river, tunnels with endless passing vehicles. Tubes with speeding trains crowded with people. The reality here was so different. Behind us, what seemed an upper city was strung along the river. Ahead of us, also, there were streets and houses, the city of the workers. A bell was tolling. Along all the roads, as we could see now, the yellow moving spots of lights on the holiday carts headed for the festival. And there were spots of yellow torchlight from boats on the river. We were soon entering the city streets. Narrow streets they were, with primitive shacks to the sides. Women came to doorways to stare at a little cart rumbling hastily past. I was conscious of my crimson cloak,
and conscious of the sullen glances of hate which were flung at it from every side, here in the squalid, forlorn section where the workers lived. Along with every street now the carts were passing, converging to the south. They were filled, most of them, with young men and girls, all in gaudy costume. Some of them, like ourselves, were shrouded in crimson cloaks. The carts occasionally were piled with flowers. As one larger than us and moving faster rumbled by, a girl in it stood up and pelted me with blossoms. She wore a crimson robe, but it had fallen from her shoulders. I caught a glimpse of her face, framed in flowing dark hair, and eyes of laughter in them, mocking me, alluring. We came at last to the end of the island. There seemed to be 1,000 or more people arriving, and here already. The tip of the island had an esplanade with a broad canopy down it. Behind it, burning torches of wood gave flames of yellow, red, and blue fire. A throng of excited young people promenaded the walk, watching the arriving boats. And here, behind the walk at the water's edge, was a garden of trees and lawn, shrubs and beds of tall, vivid flowers. Nooks were here to shelter lovers. Pools of water glinted red and green with the reflected torchlight. In one of the pools, I saw a group of girls bathing, sportive as dolphins. To one side, at a little distance up the river, banked against the water, was a broad, low building, the palace of the king. About it were 2 broad gardens, with shrubs and flowers, and the whole was surrounded by a high metal fence which was spiked on top. The main gate was near at hand, and we left our cart. Close to the gate was a guard standing alert, a jaunty fellow in leather pantaloons and leather jacket, with a spiked helmet, in his hands a huge, sharp-pointed lance. The gardens of the palace, what we could see of them anyway, seemed empty, but nothing the favored few might enter here. But as I climbed from the cart, I got the impression that just inside the fence a figure was lurking. It started away as we approached the gate. The guard hadn't seen it, the drab figure of a man in what seemed to be dripping garments, as though he'd perhaps swum in from the water, and Jarek saw him as well. He muttered, "They're everywhere." Hope led us to the gate. The guard recognized her, and at her imperious gesture he stood aside. We passed within. I saw the palace now as a long winged structure of timber and stone, with a high tower at the end of one wing. The building fronted the river, but here on the garden side there was a broad doorway up an incline, 20 feet up and over a small bridge, spanning what seemed to be a dry moat. Beyond a small platform, then an oval archway, the main entrance to the building. Derek and I, shrouded in our crimson cloaks with hoods covering us to the eyes, followed Hope into the palace. Alright, so we will pick up with Chapter 6 next week. Unfortunately, that's all the time I have for Astounding
Stories of Super Science.
So, that was Paper Cuts, everybody. Tune in next week for Chapter 5 of this peculiar story of a man joining his friend in another world. And hopefully, we'll finish the January issue so we can move on to February the week after that. Coming up music-wise after me is Return to the Moon by Elvi. So that's always serendipitous. That's a band I quite enjoy. Thanks for listening, everybody.